Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world that glittered like diamonds but was built on sand. Imagine Paris in 1900, when electric lights first turned night into day, when women danced in gowns worth more than a factory worker's lifetime salary, when champagne flowed like water at Maxim's restaurant, while seamstresses stitched those very gowns until their fingers bled. This was the Belle Époque, the beautiful era, and it had exactly 14 years left before the entire world would shatter. The women who lived through it had no idea they were dancing on the edge of an abyss. Let me tell you why this matters, why their stories still echo through time, and why the most beautiful era in history was also one of the cruelest. Before we step into this vanished world together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. But only if the story truly speaks to you. Share it with someone who loves history, or leave a comment telling me where you are right now as you listen to this. Are you in bed with the lights low, driving home after a long day? I genuinely want to know. And now, dim those lights, let the room grow soft around you. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's travel back in time together to a Paris that no longer exists. The year is 1890. Queen Victoria still sits on the British throne. The Eiffel Tower is just 1 year old, still controversial, still considered an eyesore by many Parisians who wanted it torn down. The Franco-Prussian War ended 19 years ago, leaving France wounded but determined to prove itself once again as the centre of civilization, culture, and above all, beauty. And oh, did they prove it. Paris became a city that seemed to exist in a permanent state of celebration. The boulevards, redesigned by Baron Haussmann, stretched wide and elegant, lined with gas lamps that were rapidly being replaced by the new electric lights. Can you imagine seeing electric streetlights for the first time? The glow they cast was steadier, brighter, almost magical compared to flickering gas flames. Paris literally sparkled. But here is what most people do not realize about the Belle Époque. The name itself, the beautiful era, was not coined until after World War I. It was a term born of nostalgia, of looking back at what was lost. The people living through it from 1890 to 1914 did not call it beautiful. They did not know they were living in a golden age. They certainly did not know it was the last golden age Europe would ever see. Let me give you some numbers to help you understand the scale of this illusion. In 1900, the French elite spent an estimated 15 million francs annually on fashion alone. That is roughly $270 million in today's money, spent every single year just on clothes, just in Paris. Meanwhile, 67% of working-class women in the city lived below the poverty line. 67%. 2/3 of the women in Paris could barely afford bread, while the other third wore gowns that cost more than a house. The contrast was not just economic. It was a complete separation of reality. If you were a woman born into the upper classes, your life revolved around an endless calendar of social obligations. The season in London, the races at Longchamp, the opera, the theatre, the afternoon calls where you would spend exactly 15 minutes in someone's drawing room before moving to the next house. Your days were structured around costume changes. You would wear a morning dress, then change for luncheon, then change again for afternoon calls, then change for tea, then change for dinner, and finally change into an evening gown for whatever entertainment awaited after dinner. I want you to really picture this. Some women changed clothes 7 or 8 times a day. They could not dress themselves. The gowns were engineered with so many hooks, buttons, and laces that you needed a lady's maid to get in and out of them. You were essentially helpless without servants. Your independence did not exist. But if you were born poor, if you were one of the women who made those gowns, your reality was so different it might as well have been a different planet. You worked 14 to 18 hours a day in workshops where silence was enforced. Speaking could get you fired. You hunched over endless meters of silk and lace, your eyes straining in poor light, your back aching, your fingers pricked bloody by needles. And at the end of that brutal day, you walked home to a cramped room in the working-class districts, where you ate whatever cheap food you could afford. Here is a detail that haunts me. In 1900, 1 kilogram of bread cost a seamstress 2 hours of wages. A bottle of champagne which the wealthy drank without thought cost half a day's salary. A single seat at the opera, not even a good seat, cost 4 months of wages. 4 months. Imagine working from January to April every single day just to afford to sit in the back of a theatre for one night. The women who could afford those opera seats never thought about the women who sewed their gowns. Why would they? The class divide was so vast, so complete, that they might as well have been different species, and yet they passed each other on the streets. The lady in her carriage, the seamstress on foot. They existed in the same city, breathed the same air, but lived in entirely separate worlds. Now, I mentioned World War I earlier. I mentioned that the Belle Époque had 14 years left in 1890, but nobody knew that. Nobody could have imagined it. The prevailing belief among the educated classes was that Europe had evolved beyond major wars. Technology was advancing so rapidly, science was making such incredible progress. Economies were so interconnected that surely massive warfare was a thing of the past. They believed they were living in an age of permanent peace and prosperity. They believed progress was inevitable and endless. They were building monuments to this confidence. The Paris Universal Exposition of 1900 showcased electric lights, moving sidewalks, the newly invented cinema, X-ray machines, diesel engines. The world felt like it was racing toward an impossibly bright future. And all the while the political tensions were building, the arms race was accelerating. Alliances were being formed that would drag entire continents into war. But at a dinner party in Paris, at a ball in Vienna, at a country house weekend in England, nobody talked about these things. It would have been terribly rude to bring up politics or military build-ups when there was champagne to drink and gossip to share. Let me tell you about the Titanic, because it is the perfect metaphor for this entire era. The ship launched in 1912, just 2 years before World War I would begin. It was called Unsinkable. It was the largest, most luxurious passenger ship ever built. The first-class dining room was decorated in the style of Louis XVI. The grand staircase was oak and wrought iron, topped with a glass dome. Wealthy women brought dozens of trunks filled with gowns for the voyage. It was designed to be a floating palace, a testament to human achievement and luxury. You know what happened. On April 14th, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in less than 3 hours. More than 1,500 people died. The lifeboats were not sufficient. The ship that could not sink sank. The Belle Époque was the Titanic, beautiful, confident, unsinkable, and doomed. But here is what I want you to understand. This is not just a story about rich people being oblivious before a war. This is a story about women and how their lives were shaped, constrained, and sometimes destroyed by the very era that claimed to celebrate beauty and progress. Because while the Belle Époque was busy being beautiful, it was also quietly killing women in dozens of ways. It killed them in childbirth at shocking rates. It killed them with corsets that deformed their organs. It killed them in factories and workshops where they laboured under conditions that would be illegal today. It killed them through social rules so rigid that stepping outside them could mean total exile from society. And yet, and this is the fascinating part, this was also the era when women began to fight back in organised, sustained ways. The feminist movement, the suffragette movement, the fight for the right to vote, to own property, to control their own money. All of this was happening simultaneously with the balls and the gowns and the illusion of perfection. The Belle Époque was a golden cage. Some women lived in luxury inside it, others were crushed beneath it, and a brave few were trying to pry open the bars. I think about a photograph I once saw from this era. It showed 67 factory workers, all women, sitting in rows in front of their workplace in Paris. They made the decorative scenery for the Opéra Garnier, that magnificent building with its grand staircase and velvet seats and crystal chandeliers. These women created beauty but would never experience it. They could not afford a ticket to the opera. They worked all day making the magic, then went home to poverty. Look at their faces in that photograph if you ever get the chance. Some look tired, some look defiant, some look like they are just enduring, just surviving another day. And I wonder, did they have dreams? Did they hope for something better? Did they imagine their daughters or granddaughters would live different lives? They could not have known that in 14 years everything would change. The war would come, their sons and brothers and husbands would die in trenches. The women themselves would flood into factories to make munitions. They would take over the jobs men left behind. They would drive ambulances, work as nurses at the front lines, run farms and businesses. And when the war finally ended, they would have earned rights they never had before. The right to vote, the right to work, the right to wear practical clothing instead of corsets and gowns. But all of that is still in the future as we stand here in 1890. Right now, the Belle Époque is just beginning. The party is just getting started, and nobody, absolutely nobody, knows that the clock is ticking. So as we move through this series together, I want you to keep that context in mind. We're going to explore the lives of women in the Belle Époque from every angle. The courtesans who had more freedom than married women, the seamstresses who sewed dreams they would never wear, the debutantes sold in marriage markets, the dancers who became famous and died forgotten, the feminists who were mocked and imprisoned, the designers who created art, the mothers who died in childbirth, the rebels who wore trousers and cut their hair short. Each of these women lived in the shadow of the coming catastrophe. None of them knew it, and that is what makes their stories both beautiful and heartbreaking. The Belle Époque was not really beautiful. It was gilded, yes, it was sparkling, it was designed to dazzle, but underneath the surface it was fragile, unfair, and unsustainable. Luxury without a future is just another word for delusion. And now that we have set the stage, now that you understand what kind of world we are stepping into, it is time to look more closely at the physical reality of being a woman in this era. Because before we can understand the social constraints, the economic exploitation, the fight for freedom, we need to understand something very basic and very brutal. We need to talk about what these women wore on their bodies every single day. We need to talk about the corset. And specifically, we need to talk about the S-Ben corset, which was both a marvel of engineering and an instrument of torture. That is where we are going next. The cage of beauty, the price of elegance, the truth about what happened when fashion decided the female body needed to be reshaped into something that defied anatomy itself. But for now, take a breath, let these images settle in your mind. A glittering Paris, electric lights reflecting off champagne glasses, women in silk gowns dancing until dawn, and just out of sight, in the workshops, in the factories, in the hospitals, in the margins of this beautiful era, other women struggling, suffering, and beginning to fight for something better. This was the Belle Époque, the last golden age, the beautiful lie. And we are just getting started. So let me ask you something. Have you ever worn something so uncomfortable that you could not wait to get home and take it off? Maybe high heels that pinched your toes, or a tie that felt like it was choking you, or shapewear that made it hard to breathe. Now multiply that discomfort by 100, Add steel and whalebone, tighten it until you physically cannot breathe deeply, and wear it for 16 hours a day, every single day of your life from age 13 onward. That was the corset, and in the Belle Époque, it reached its most extreme, most dangerous form. The S-bend corset. Let me tell you exactly what that means. Picture this. It is 1903. You are a young woman getting dressed for the day, but you cannot dress yourself. Your lady's maid arrives at 7 in the morning to begin the process. You're wearing your chemise, a thin cotton undergarment. Over this goes the corset. The S-bend corset is not like the corsets you might have seen in movies. This is engineering, brutal engineering, designed to reshape the human body into something it was never meant to be. The corset is made of 6 to 8 layers of heavy fabric, reinforced with steel stays running vertically up and down. At the front, there is a rigid piece of steel called a busk that runs from your breasts to your pelvis. At the back, there are anywhere from 20 to 30 steel or whalebone stays creating a rigid cage. But here is where it gets truly bizarre. The S-bend corset was designed to create a specific silhouette. Your breasts had to thrust forward, your waist had to curve sharply inward, and your hips had to push backward, creating an S shape when viewed from the side. The human spine does not naturally bend this way. The human body was not built for this, but fashion demanded it, and women's bodies would be forced to comply. Your maid begins the lacing process. You hold on to the bedpost or a piece of furniture because you're going to need support. She starts at the top, pulling the laces tight, then works her way down, pulling, always pulling tighter. When she reaches your waist, she really puts her weight into it. You're told to breathe out, to make yourself as small as possible. The laces tighten until you genuinely cannot take a full breath. The goal was a waist measurement of 18 to 20 inches. Let that sink in for a moment. 18 inches. That is 45 centimeters. For reference, the average woman's waist today measures about 30 to 35 inches. They were trying to make women's waists half the natural size. And here is something that truly shocked me when I learned it. Young girls started wearing corsets at age 12 or 13, right when their bodies were still developing. The corset literally molded their growing bones and organs into unnatural positions. By the time a woman was fully grown, her ribcage would be permanently deformed, her organs displaced, her body reshaped. Now, you might be thinking, surely this was optional. Surely women could choose not to wear them. In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. A woman who appeared in public without a corset was considered indecent, improper, practically naked. It would be like someone walking down the street today without pants. The social shame would be total and immediate. But let me tell you what the corset actually did to women's bodies, because this is where it gets genuinely horrifying. First, breathing. You could not take a full breath. Your lungs were compressed. Women were taught to take shallow breaths from the upper chest instead of deep breaths from the diaphragm. This constant shallow breathing led to chronic fatigue, headaches, and something called fainting culture. Women fainted constantly in the Belle Époque. It was considered normal, even romantic. Fainting couches were standard furniture in every home. But women were not fainting because they were delicate flowers. They were fainting because they could not get enough oxygen. Second, your internal organs, your liver, stomach, intestines, they all had to go somewhere. The corset pushed everything downward and inward. Doctors at the time documented cases of women whose livers had been pushed down so far that they were sitting where their intestines should be. Digestive problems were universal. Women could not eat large meals because there was no room in their compressed torsos for food. That is one reason why the wealthy ate many small courses at dinner instead of larger portions. It was not just elegance, it was physical necessity. Third, and this is particularly grim, there were accidents. In 1903, a woman in Paris tripped and fell. The steel busk at the front of her corset drove into her liver. She died from internal bleeding. This was not a freak occurrence. Medical journals from the era document multiple cases of corset-related injuries. Women who were in accidents, women who bent the wrong way, women whose stays broke and stabbed them. Let me read you something from a medical text published in 1907. This is from a British doctor named Robert Dickinson. He wrote, quote, "The corset compresses the lower ribs, displaces the liver and stomach, and causes chronic indigestion and constipation. It prevents deep breathing and leads to a generally weakened constitution. In extreme cases, it can cause permanent deformity of the skeletal structure." Think about that for a second. Doctors knew. Medical professionals were publishing papers about how dangerous corsets were, and yet fashion did not change, because fashion was never really about what women wanted. It was about control. It was about making women's bodies conform to an ideal that had nothing to do with health, comfort, or functionality. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting. The S-bend corset created something called the monobosom. Instead of emphasizing two separate breasts, the corset pushed everything upward and forward into one large shelf-like structure. Imagine your entire chest compressed into a single horizontal line. It looked bizarre. There are photographs from this era, and when you see the monobosom, it honestly looks like someone photoshopped a woman's body incorrectly. But this was considered the height of elegance. Fashion magazines rhapsodized about it. They called it classical, comparing it to ancient Greek statues. They published illustrations showing the ideal silhouette, the perfect S-curve, the prestigious monobosom, and women destroyed their bodies trying to achieve it. I want you to imagine what it was like to live in this. Imagine waking up every morning and having to be laced into this cage. Imagine never being able to bend over comfortably, never being able to sit back in a chair and relax, never being able to take a deep breath. Imagine eating dinner with friends but only being able to eat tiny amounts because your stomach is compressed. Imagine going to a dance and having to leave early because you're genuinely struggling to breathe. And now imagine being told this is beautiful, this is feminine, this is what makes you desirable and proper and worthy of respect. There is a letter I came across from a young woman in London, written in 1901. She was writing to her sister, and she said, "The new corsets are torture, but what can one do? To appear loose-bodied would be social death. I endure it as all women must." The resignation in those words, the acceptance that suffering is simply the price of being a woman in society. But here is something fascinating. Working-class women also wore corsets, but theirs were different. They could not afford the heavily boned, steel-reinforced versions that wealthy women wore. Their corsets were simpler, less rigid, made of cheaper materials. And ironically, this probably saved their health. They could breathe better, move better, work better. The wealthy women, in their quest for perfect elegance, were actually more physically restricted than their servants. There is a wonderful irony in that, is there not? The working-class woman, who the wealthy looked down upon as coarse and common, was actually healthier and more capable of physical activity. Meanwhile, the wealthy woman, laced so tightly she could barely breathe, needed help to get dressed, to walk upstairs, sometimes even to sit down or stand up. This brings me to another aspect of the corset that I find particularly disturbing, the dependence. When you cannot dress yourself, when you need a servant to lace and unlace you, when you cannot even go to the bathroom without assistance because your clothing is so complex, you're not independent. You're fundamentally dependent on other people for your most basic needs. And that was the point. A woman who could not dress herself could not leave without preparation. She could not make spontaneous decisions. She required a household, servant structure. The corset was not just about beauty, it was about control. It kept women literally bound. Now, I mentioned earlier that young girls started wearing corsets at 12 or 13. Let me paint you a picture of what that looked like. There are photographs of young girls at their first formal events, weddings, balls, whatever. They're wearing scaled-down versions of adult corsets, and if you look closely at their faces, you can see discomfort. Some of them look scared. They are experiencing for the first time what they will experience every day for the rest of their lives. There was even a smaller, softer corset for children as young as 5 or 6. It was called a Liberty bodice, which is a hilariously inappropriate name for something designed to restrict a child's body. The idea was to train young girls early to get their bodies used to the sensation of compression so that the tighter corsets of adolescence would not be as shocking. Generational trauma imposed through clothing. Mothers who had suffered through corsets their entire lives helped lace their daughters into the same torture devices. What does that do to you psychologically? To know your mother is inflicting on you the same pain she endured, not out of cruelty, but because it is simply how things are done. But let me tell you about the women who fought back, because not everyone accepted this quietly. There was a movement called rational dress, and it started gaining traction in the 1880s and 90s. Women argued for clothing that allowed them to move, to breathe, to live active lives. They designed alternative corsets that were less restrictive. They advocated for looser clothing, divided skirts that were almost like pants, and most radically, the complete elimination of corsets. The backlash was ferocious. Newspapers mocked these women mercilessly. Political cartoons showed them as ugly, mannish, unfeminine. Doctors, mostly male doctors, wrote articles claiming that women who did not wear corsets would suffer from wandering uterus and other made-up medical conditions. The rational dress movement was painted as dangerous, unnatural, a threat to femininity itself. And yet slowly things began to change. By 1908, the S-bend corset was starting to fall out of fashion. A straighter, slightly less restrictive style was emerging. It was not freedom, not by a long shot, but it was progress. The monobust disappeared. Waists were still compressed, but not quite as severely. What drove this change? Partly it was women's increasing participation in physical activities. Tennis, bicycling, golf. These were becoming acceptable for women to enjoy, and you simply cannot play tennis in an S-bend corset. You cannot ride a bicycle when you cannot breathe. So fashion reluctantly had to adapt. But the other factor, and I think this is important, was the suffragette movement. Women who were marching in the streets demanding the right to vote were also demanding the right to breathe. They saw the connections. Political oppression, social oppression, and physical oppression through clothing were all part of the same system. You cannot fight for your rights when you're too busy trying not to faint. There is a photograph from a suffragette march in London in 1911. The women are wearing white dresses, and you can see clearly that some of them are wearing corsets and some are not. The ones without corsets stand straighter. They look stronger. And they are the ones at the front of the march carrying the banners, shouting the loudest. Clothing is never just clothing, it is always political. Now, before we move on from this topic, I want to leave you with one more thought. We like to think we have moved beyond this, that modern women are not subject to this kind of physical control. But are we really free? Think about the body standards imposed on women today. The pressure to be thin, to have a flat stomach, to have curves in the right places but not the wrong ones. Think about cosmetic surgery, extreme diets, shapewear that is just a corset by another name. The S-bend corset is gone, yes, but the idea that women's bodies need to be reshaped, controlled and moulded to fit an artificial ideal, that never went away, it just changed form. The women of the Belle Époque were trapped in literal cages of steel and bone. We might not wear corsets anymore, but we still live in a world that tells women their natural bodies are not good enough. The cage looks different now, but it is still a cage, and that is something worth thinking about as you drift off tonight. But we are not done with the Belle Époque yet, not even close. Because while some women were being quite literally bound by their clothing, other women existed in a completely different world. A world where they had more freedom, more money, and more power than respectable married women could ever dream of. I am talking about the demi-monde, the courtesans, the women who lived in the shadows but shone brighter than anyone else, the women who were not respectable but who were absolutely unforgettable. Let me tell you about them next, about Liane de Pougy, who went from being an abused wife to one of the richest women in Paris, about La Belle Otero, who bankrupted princes and kings with her beauty, about the glittering half-world where the rules were different, and women, paradoxically, had more agency than their respectable sisters ever could. Because if you think the corset story was complicated, wait until you hear about the women who used their bodies as weapons, as tools, as pathways to power in a world that gave women almost no other options. The demi-monde awaits. There is a photograph from 1902 that I cannot stop thinking about. It shows a woman reclining on a velvet sofa draped in pearls that would cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Her gown is silk, custom-made by one of Paris's finest designers. The room behind her is decorated with oil paintings, fresh flowers in crystal vases, and furniture that belonged in a palace. She is not royalty. She is not even respectable. She is Liane de Pougy, one of the most famous courtesans in Paris, and at that moment she was probably wealthier and more powerful than 99% of the so-called respectable women in France. This is the paradox of the demi-monde, the half-world, the shadow society where women who broke all the rules somehow ended up with more freedom than women who followed them. Let me explain what I mean, because this is going to challenge everything you think you know about women's liberation in the Belle Époque. The word demi-monde literally translates to half-world. It was coined by a French playwright named Alexandre Dumas the Younger in 1855. He wrote a play about women who existed on the fringes of respectable society, not quite criminal, not quite acceptable. These were the courtesans, the kept women, the mistresses of the wealthy and powerful. But here's the crucial part. These women were not desperate streetwalkers. They were elite professionals. They were educated, cultured, multilingual. They knew art, music, literature, politics. They could hold conversations with intellectuals, charm diplomats, and navigate high society with more grace than many women born into it. And they made fortunes doing it. The top tier of courtesans, the ones called les grandes horizontales or sometimes les grandes cocottes, lived lives of almost unimaginable luxury. They owned mansions, they had servants, carriages, jewels worth hundreds of thousands of francs. They travelled first class to Monte Carlo, to London, to the Mediterranean. They were celebrities. Their photographs were sold as postcards. Crowds gathered to watch them enter the theatre or promenade through the park. And here is the part that is going to sound absolutely wild. These women, who were technically living in sin, who were ostracized by respectable society, had more legal rights and more personal freedom than married women of the upper class. Think about that. A married woman in the Belle Époque could not own property in her own name. Her money belonged to her husband. She could not sign contracts. She could not open a bank account without her husband's permission. If she inherited money from her family, her husband controlled it. She had essentially no legal personhood once she married. But a courtesan. She owned everything in her own name. The mansion, the jewels, the investments, all hers. She could sign contracts, manage money, make business decisions. She had agency. And if a relationship with a wealthy protector ended badly, she kept everything she had accumulated. Compare that to a divorced woman, who would lose her children, her social standing, and often even her personal belongings. Let me tell you about Liane de Pougy, because her story illustrates this paradox perfectly. She was born Anne-Marie Chassain in 1869 into a middle-class family. At 16, she married a man named Armand Pourpot, a naval officer. Within a year, she had a son, and her husband turned out to be violently abusive. He beat her. He threatened her life. She was trapped in a legal marriage with no way out, no rights, no protection. So she did something radical. She left. She abandoned both her husband and her infant son, and she fled to Paris with nothing. In 1889, she was 20 years old, alone, and needed to survive. She turned to the only path available to a woman in her situation: prostitution. But Liane was smart, beautiful, and ambitious. She did not stay in the lower tiers. She worked her way up through sheer determination and strategic thinking. By 1891, she had become one of the most sought-after courtesans in Paris. Kings, princes, millionaires, they all wanted her company, and she charged them accordingly. At the height of her career, Liane de Pougy earned an estimated 12,000 francs per month. To put that in perspective, a skilled seamstress earned about 60 francs per month. Liane was making 200 times what a working woman earned. She became a millionaire. She owned a mansion in Paris, a villa on the French Riviera, and enough jewellery to fill a museum. But here is what gets me about Liane's story. She was not just wealthy, she was cultured and creative. She wrote semi-autobiographical novels about the demi-monde. She performed at the Folies Bergère, one of Paris's most famous theatres. She had relationships with both men and women, openly bisexual at a time when that could destroy a respectable woman's reputation. But Liane was not respectable, so she was free. She had a famous affair with Natalie Clifford Barney, an American writer who ran a literary salon in Paris. Their relationship was passionate, tumultuous, and very public. Liane once showed up at the opera wearing a bracelet with both her initials and Natalie's engraved on it. Scandal erupted, people gossiped, and Liane did not care, because what could they do to her? She was already outside respectable society. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Now, does this mean Liane's life was easy or ideal? Absolutely not. She paid a price for her choices. She never saw her son again. She was barred from respectable social events. She could never be received at court. When she walked down the street, respectable women would cross to the other side to avoid her. She was more wealthy and powerful, but she was also fundamentally alone in certain ways. And this is as important, she chose that life. She had agency. Compare that to a woman trapped in an abusive marriage with no legal right to leave, no ability to support herself, no control over her own children. Which woman was more free? Let me tell you about another member of the demi-monde. Carolina Otero, known as La Belle Otero, the beautiful Otero. She was born in Spain in 1868, into poverty so extreme it is hard to imagine. Her real name was Agustina Otero Iglesias. Her childhood was marked by violence and trauma. At age 12, she was assaulted. At 14, she ran away and began dancing to survive. By age 20, she had made her way to Marseille, then to Paris, reinventing herself as La Belle Otero, an exotic Spanish dancer. She was stunning, with dark eyes and a figure that drove men wild. And she was smart enough to capitalize on it. Otero became famous for her costumes, or rather, the lack of them. She performed at the Folies Bergère wearing outfits that were considered scandalously revealing. Her most famous costume consisted of jewels glued directly onto her skin, creating the illusion that she was wearing diamonds and emeralds but nothing else. Audiences were shocked, thrilled, and utterly captivated. But Otero's real fortune came from her relationships with powerful men. She became the mistress of kings. King Edward VII of Great Britain, King Leopold II of Belgium, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia, princes, dukes, millionaires, they all fell for her, and she extracted enormous sums from each of them. At one point, Otero owned a mansion that would be worth approximately $15 million today. She dripped in diamonds. She had a collection of jewellery so vast that she kept it in bank vaults. She travelled the world in luxury, staying in the finest hotels, eating in the best restaurants, living like royalty despite being born in a Spanish slum. But here is where Otero's story takes a dark turn, and is a reminder that even the most successful courtesans were still living precarious lives. Otero was a compulsive gambler. She spent her evenings at the casinos in Monte Carlo, betting enormous sums on roulette. Sometimes she won, more often she lost. Over the decades she gambled away almost her entire fortune. By the time she was old, the kings and princes had moved on to younger women. The money was gone, the jewels were sold. La Belle Otero died in 1965 at age 97, living in a small apartment in Nice, nearly penniless. The woman who had once owned mansions and jewels worth millions died alone and forgotten. Does that mean her life was wasted? I do not think so. For several decades she lived on her own terms. She chose her lovers, controlled her money, travelled the world. She had adventures that most women of her era could not even dream of. But it also shows you the fundamental vulnerability of the courtesan's position. There was no pension, no safety net, no retirement plan. When youth and beauty faded, so did the income. Now let me tell you about the third member of Les Grandes Trois, the three graces of the Belle Époque, Emilienne d'Alençon. Emilienne was born in Paris in 1869. Unlike Otero's poverty or Leanne's middle-class background, we do not know much about Emilienne's early life. She appears in history already formed, already a star. By age 15 she was performing as a dancer. By 19 she was the mistress of a young duke who wanted to marry her. His family was horrified. A duke marry a dancer? A courtesan? Absolutely not. They sent him away to the Congo, hoping distance would cure his infatuation. Instead, he died there of tropical fever a year later, still in love with Emilienne. Emilienne mourned him, and then she moved on because courtesans could not afford prolonged grief. She became involved with some of the most powerful men in Europe. King Leopold II of Belgium, who was simultaneously involved with Otero, which must have made for interesting gossip. King Edward VII of Great Britain, Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany. She had affairs with women as well, including the famous can-can dancer La Goulou, and yes, Liane de Pougy. The demi-monde was a small world, and apparently everyone was involved with everyone else. But here is what I find most interesting about Emilienne. She loved horses and racing. She attended every major race, bet on horses, and eventually married a jockey. Not a king, not a prince, but a jockey. And like Otero, she gambled away most of her fortune at the casinos. She died in 1946, having lived through both world wars, having seen the entire Belle Époque rise and fall. Now, why am I telling you about these three women in such detail? Because I want you to understand the complexity here. These were not victims in the traditional sense. They were not passive. They made choices, often terrible choices with limited options, but choices nonetheless. They carved out space for themselves in a world that gave women almost no power. And yet, they paid a price. They were excluded from respectability. They could never marry into the families of the men they entertained. Their children, if they had any, were illegitimate and often taken away. They grew old knowing that their value was tied entirely to their physical beauty, and when that faded, so did their security. There is a term historians use for the demimonde. They call it the half-world because these women existed in a space between two realities. They were not respectable, but they were not quite outcasts either. They were famous, but socially dead. They had money, but no security. They had freedom, but no protection. And here is the truly maddening part. The same men who kept courtesans, who showered them with money and gifts, who paraded them at the opera and the races, these same men went home to their wives and daughters and insisted on absolute virtue and modesty. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. A man could have a wife and 3 mistresses and still be considered a respectable member of society. But a woman who had even one affair, ruined, destroyed, cast out forever. The demimonde existed because of this double standard. It was a pressure valve for a hypocritical system. Men wanted excitement, passion, conversation with educated women who were not constantly chaperoned. But they could not get that from their wives, who were raised to be modest, quiet, and obedient. So they went to courtesans who were trained to be witty, engaging, and sexually available. And the courtesans, they took advantage of the system as best they could. They accumulated wealth. They gained a kind of year. They lived with more autonomy than married women. But they were still playing a rigged game. The rules were written by men for men, and women were just trying to survive within them. I think about what choices I would have made if I had been born into that era. If I had been poor, desperate, and talented, would I have become a courtesan? Would I have traded respectability for agency, social acceptance for financial independence? It is easy to judge from the comfort of the 21st century. But these women did not have our options. They worked with what they had. And what they had was their bodies, their minds, and their determination. The demimonde was not liberation. It was not feminism. It was survival. But it was also a glimpse of something radical. The idea that women could control their own lives, earn their own money, make their own choices, even if those choices came with enormous costs. Leander Pogi, after decades as a courtesan, married a Romanian prince and became Princess Ghica. She spent her final years in a convent, having converted to Catholicism. She died in 1950, at age 81, having lived through 2 world wars and the complete transformation of the world she had known. In her final years, she wrote in her diary about her youth, about the men she had known, the life she had lived. She did not seem to regret it. She had chosen her path, and she walked it all the way to the end. But while courtesans like Leanne, Otero, and Emilienne were living in luxury and scandal, there was another group of women whose lives were the exact opposite. Women who created the very gowns and jewels that made the demimonde so glamorous. Women who stitched beauty with bleeding fingers and never got to wear it themselves. We have talked about the women who wore the silk. Now it is time to talk about the women who made it. The seamstresses. The invisible army of workers who kept the Belle Époque beautiful, while they themselves suffered in shadows. Let me take you into their world next. Into the workshops where young girls worked until they collapsed. Into the reality behind every magnificent gown that swept across the floor at the opera. Into the brutal economics of beauty. Because if the demimonde was the half-world, the seamstresses were the forgotten world. And their stories deserve to be told too. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are 12 years old. You wake up at 5 in the morning in a tiny room you share with your mother and 2 sisters. There is no heat. Your fingers are stiff with cold. You eat a piece of stale bread if there is any, and then you walk through the dark Paris streets to a building on Rue de la Paix, one of the most fashionable addresses in the city. You climb 3 flights of stairs to a workshop. The room is cramped, poorly lit, and filled with 30 other girls and women hunched over sewing tables. You take your place, and then you sew. For 14 hours, maybe 16, maybe more. You sew until your eyes blur and your back screams and your fingers bleed onto the silk you are stitching. And if you speak, if you complain, if you slow down even for a moment, you will be fired. And there are 100 other desperate girls waiting to take your place. This was the reality for thousands of women in Belle Époque Paris. While courtesans wore gowns worth fortunes and society ladies changed clothes 7 times a day, an invisible army of seamstresses created every stitch of that beauty while barely surviving themselves. Let me tell you their story, because it is one of the darkest chapters of the beautiful era, and it is a story that rarely gets told. The fashion industry in Belle Époque Paris was enormous. This was the era when haute couture was born, when designers like Worth, Paquin and Doucet were creating art you could wear. Every wealthy woman in Europe and America wanted Parisian fashion. The demand was insatiable, and someone had to make all those gowns. That someone was an army of young women and girls who worked in conditions that would be illegal today. Most of them came from the countryside, from poor families who sent them to Paris hoping that they could earn money to send home. They arrived with nothing, no connections, no protection, no understanding of how brutal the city could be. The workshops were called ateliers, which sounds romantic until you see inside one. These are not the elegant salons where wealthy clients came for fittings. Those front rooms were beautiful, carefully designed to project luxury and refinement. But the actual work happened in back rooms, in attics, in cramped spaces where natural light barely penetrated. A typical workshop employed anywhere from 20 to 50 seamstresses. They sat shoulder to shoulder at long tables, hunched over their work. The light was dim, usually just a few gas lamps or candles, which meant the women strained their eyes constantly. Many went partially blind by age 30 from the close work in poor light. The day started at 6 in the morning. That was the official start time. But during busy seasons, before a major event like the Grand Prix races or the opera season, the hours became nightmarish. In 1900, a labour inspector documented what she found before the Grand Prix. The seamstresses had been working for 30 hours straight. 30 hours, no sleep, no breaks except for brief moments to eat bread and drink water. They sewed through the entire night and into the next day because the gowns had to be finished, because wealthy clients did not care about the human cost of their clothing. Think about that. Have you ever stayed awake for 30 hours? How did you feel? Now imagine spending that entire time hunched over detailed handwork, stitching tiny beads onto silk, creating elaborate embroidery, all while someone watches to make sure you do not slow down or make mistakes. Let me tell you about Jeanne Bouvier, because we know her story in her own words. She wrote a memoir later in life about her experiences as a seamstress in Belle Époque Paris. It is one of the few first-hand accounts we have from the women who actually lived this. Jeanne was born in 1865. Her family was poor, and when she was 11 years old, they sent her to work in a silk factory in Lyon. She worked there for years, but the pay was terrible and the conditions were brutal, so in her late teens she moved to Paris hoping for better opportunities. She found work in the garment industry, but she quickly discovered that Paris was not the land of opportunity she had imagined. She was paid by the day, not by the hour, which meant there was no guarantee of work. Some days she worked 14 hours, other days there was no work at all, and she earned nothing. In her memoir, she describes the rules of the workshop. Absolute silence was enforced. You could not talk to the woman sitting next to you. You could not hum, you could not even sigh too loudly. The reasoning was that talking would slow down productivity, but the effect was dehumanizing. Imagine sitting elbow to elbow with other women for 14 hours a day and never being allowed to speak. Jeanne wrote about days when she worked until 2 in the morning, stitching gowns for wealthy clients who were attending balls and parties. And then she would walk home through the dark streets of Paris, exhausted, afraid, barely able to see straight. She would sleep for a few hours and then return to the workshop at 6 in the morning to start again. The pay was insulting. We talked earlier about how seamstresses earned about 60 francs per month, but that was for skilled workers who had steady employment. Young girls, apprentices, often earned far less. And here is the cruel part. They had to pay for their own supplies. Needles, thread, sometimes even the fabric to practice on. These costs were deducted from their already meagre wages. Let me give you some specific numbers to put this in perspective. In 1900, a seamstress working full-time might earn 2 francs per day. A kilo of bread cost about 40 centimes. A small room to rent cost 20 to 30 francs per month. Clothes, which they had to make themselves because they certainly could not afford to buy ready-made, cost time and materials. After rent and food, there was almost nothing left. But the women who made gowns that cost thousands of francs? They could not afford to buy the scraps. The leftover fabric from a single wealthy woman's gown could have been made into dresses for 10 poor women. But the workshops kept the scraps or sold them, and the seamstresses went home in threadbare clothes they had patched over and over. Now, the fashion houses would tell you they were providing employment, giving opportunities to poor girls who otherwise would have nothing. And in a sense this was true. But it was exploitation dressed up as charity. The owners of these fashion houses became wealthy, the designers became famous, and the women who actually created the garments remained invisible and impoverished. There were labour laws, technically. France passed laws limiting the working day, prohibiting night work for women, requiring certain safety standards. But these laws were barely enforced, and fashion houses found creative ways around them. One common tactic was to send work home with the seamstress. Technically, the workshop closed at 7 or 8 in the evening in compliance with the law, but the seamstress would leave carrying bundles of unfinished work that had to be completed by the next morning. So she would go to her tiny room and sew by candlelight until midnight or later, all without additional pay because this was homework and not subject to labour regulations. Inspectors rarely caught this because they visited during official working hours. And even when they did find violations, the fines were minimal. For a workshop owner making thousands of francs per month, a 50-franc fine was just a cost of doing business. There is a story from 1906 that haunts me, and I need to warn you, it is disturbing. A labour inspector arrived unannounced at a prestigious fashion house in Paris. This was one of the famous names, a designer who dressed royalty and aristocrats. The inspector was about to enter the workroom when the owner quickly intercepted her, invited her into the elegant front salon for tea, tried to delay her. The inspector insisted on seeing the workroom. She opened the door and found it suspiciously empty, even though she knew this was supposed to be a busy day. She started looking around, checking the closets and storage areas, and she found a young seamstress locked in a wardrobe. The girl had been working illegally long hours, and when the inspector arrived, the owner panicked and hid her in the closet rather than get caught violating labour laws. The owner forgot about her. The girl suffocated in that wardrobe and died. She was 16 years old. When the story broke, there was some public outrage, some newspaper coverage, but ultimately nothing really changed. The owner paid a fine, the fashion house continued operating, and young girls continued dying, if not from suffocation, then from exhaustion, disease, and despair. Now you might wonder, why did these women accept these conditions? Why did they not leave, find other work, do something else? The answer is that they had no other options. Most of these women had no education beyond basic literacy, if that. They had no family connections, no money to start businesses, no access to professions. The garment industry was one of the few sectors that employed women in large numbers, and the fashion houses knew this. They knew the workers were desperate and used that desperation to drive wages down and hours up. There were attempts to organise, to form unions, to demand better conditions. But these efforts were constantly suppressed. Women who tried to organise were fired immediately. Blacklists circulated among workshop owners. If you caused trouble at one fashion house, no other house would hire you. And there was another form of control, more insidious. Many seamstresses lived in boarding houses that were owned by or connected to the fashion houses. So if you lost your job, you also lost your housing. The threat of homelessness kept women compliant. But despite all of this, despite the fear and the exhaustion and the poverty, some women did resist, and the stories deserve to be told. In 1901, a group of seamstresses in Paris organised a strike. They were not asking for much. They wanted a 12-hour workday instead of 14 or 16 hours. They wanted one day off per week. They wanted to be paid for overtime. Basic, reasonable demands. The fashion houses refused. The owners claimed that granting these demands would make French fashion uncompetitive, would drive business to other countries, would destroy the industry. The same arguments employers always use when workers ask for dignity. The strike lasted for weeks. The women who participated knew they risked everything, and they did lose. The fashion houses hired replacement workers, brought in girls from the countryside who were even more desperate, and broke the strike. But the women who participated in that strike, even though they lost, they planted seeds. They showed that resistance was possible, and over the following decades, the labour movement in France grew stronger, partly because of the courage of those seamstresses who stood up in 1901. Let me tell you about the contrast that I find most striking. There was a famous restaurant in Paris called Maxim's. It was where the wealthy went to see and be seen. Courtesans dined with their protectors. Society ladies showed off their newest gowns. The menu featured champagne, caviar, oysters, elaborate multi-course meals. A single dinner at Maxim's could cost 50 to 100 francs. That was 2 to 4 weeks' wages for a seamstress. A bottle of champagne cost more than she earned in a day. And the gowns. Oh, the gowns worn at Maxim's were extraordinary. Silk, lace, hand embroidery, beading that took hundreds of hours to complete. Each gown represented months of a seamstress's life, countless hours of meticulous work. But the seamstress who made that gown, she would never enter Maxim's. She could not afford a single glass of water there. And the woman wearing the gown probably never thought about the person who made it. Why would she? They existed in completely different worlds. This is what I mean when I say the Belle Époque was built on exploitation. The beauty, the elegance, the luxury that defined the era, it all rested on the backs of poor women who were worked nearly to death for pennies. And it was not just the seamstresses. The entire fashion industry employed women in exploitative conditions. The lace makers who went blind from the fine work, the flower makers who created the elaborate decorations for hats, working with toxic dyes, the glove makers, the shoemakers, the embroiderers, all of them working brutal hours for minimal pay. There is a photograph from this era that I think everyone should see. It shows 67 women sitting in front of a factory in Paris. They made decorative scenery for the Opéra Garnier, that magnificent building with its crystal chandeliers and velvet seats. These women created beauty for others to enjoy but could never afford to experience it themselves. Look at their faces if you ever find that photograph. Some look defiant, some look exhausted, some look like they've already given up. And I wonder about each of them. Did they have dreams? Did they hope their daughters would have better lives? Did they ever imagine that someday women would have rights, protections, the ability to demand fair treatment? They could not have known that in just 14 years, World War I would begin and change everything. That women would flood into factories to replace men who went to war. That women would prove themselves capable of any work, any job. That after the war, labour protections would strengthen, unions would gain power, and slowly, painfully slowly, working conditions would improve. But in 1900, none of that had happened yet. The seamstresses of Belle, Époque, Paris lived and died in obscurity, creating beauty they would never own, wearing threadbare clothes while stitching silk for others, going hungry while sewing gowns for women who would wear them to elaborate dinners. This is the invisible cost of the beautiful era. For every woman dancing in a silk gown, there were 10 women who had bled to create it. And here is what makes me angriest about this whole system. It was not necessary. The fashion houses were making enormous profits. They could have paid fair wages, limited hours, provided decent working conditions, and still made money. But they chose not to because there was no reason to. The workers had no power, no voice, no alternatives, and so they were exploited to the maximum extent possible. The Belle Époque likes to present itself as an era of beauty, culture, and refinement. But beauty created through suffering is not beautiful at all. It is ugly, no matter how much silk and lace you drape over it. So the next time you see a photograph of a Belle Époque gown, the next time you admire the elaborate beading and embroidery, I want you to think about the hands that created it. Think about the young girl hunched over a table in dim light, stitching for 16 hours straight. Think about her hunger, her exhaustion, her bleeding fingers, and remember that she was invisible to the people who wore what she made. But she should not be invisible to us. Her story matters, her suffering matters, and her resistance, however small, however unsuccessful in the moment, that matters too. But not all women in the Belle Époque were trapped by poverty or exploitation. Some women were trapped in a different kind of cage, a gilded one. They had wealth, status, and beautiful lives mapped out for them from birth. But they had no freedom to choose those lives. They were commodities to be traded in a market that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with money and status. I am talking about the marriage market, the débutantes, the young women of the upper class who were groomed, trained, and ultimately sold to the highest bidder. Let me take you into that world next, because it is just as disturbing as the workshop, just in a completely different way. From girls who stitched in darkness to girls who danced in ballrooms, from poverty to privilege, the cage just changed shape, but it was still a cage. Wealth does not always mean freedom. Sometimes it just means you are a more expensive commodity. On November 6, 1895, massive crowds gathered outside St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The police had to be called in to control the throngs of people, mostly young women from good families, desperate to catch a glimpse of what newspapers were calling the wedding of the century. Inside the church, the decorations were so extravagant that they exceeded anything ever seen before in America. Orchids, roses, and lilies covered every surface. The cost of the flowers alone would have fed a working-class family for a year. The bride arrived 20 minutes late. When she finally appeared, anyone who looked closely beneath her veil would have seen that her face was swollen, her eyes red and puffy. She had been crying, not tears of joy, tears of despair. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. She was 18 years old. She was one of the wealthiest young women in the world, worth approximately $4 billion in today's money. And she was being the groom was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, cousin to the future Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He was marrying Consuelo for one reason and one reason only: her money. He needed $2.5 million in railroad stock to save his ancestral home, Blenheim Palace, from bankruptcy. Consuelo needed nothing from him, but her mother had decided this marriage would happen, and so it did. And on her wedding day, standing at the altar in a gown that cost nearly $7,000, Consuelo wept. This is what marriage looked like for wealthy women in the Belle Époque. It was not romance, it was a transaction, and the women were the merchandise. Let me tell you how this system worked, because it is both fascinating and absolutely infuriating. First, understand the economics. By the late 1800s, British aristocracy was in trouble. They owned massive estates, historic castles, thousands of acres of land, but agriculture was declining. International grain imports were undercutting British farms. The cost of maintaining these enormous properties was skyrocketing. Many noble families were land-rich but cash-poor, struggling to pay for basic upkeep, let alone the lavish lifestyle expected of their class. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American industrialists were making fortunes. Railroads, steel, oil, banking, these industries created wealth on a scale never seen before. But here is the thing about American money. It had no history, it had no pedigree. It was called new money, and in the rigid social hierarchy of places like New York, new money was looked down upon by old money families. The solution? Trade. American cash for British titles. It was mutually beneficial. The British aristocrats got the money to save their estates. The American families got social prestige, entry into European high society, and most importantly, a title: Duchess, Countess, Lady. Between 1870 and 1914, this happened over and over. According to historical records, 102 American women married British aristocrats during this period. If you expand it to include all of European nobility, that number jumps to 454 marriages. 454 women traded across the Atlantic like cargo, and the amounts of money involved were staggering. Consuelo Vanderbilt's dowry was the largest on record. The Duke of Marlborough received 50,000 shares of railroad stock worth $2.5 million, which is approximately $91 million today. Plus, Consuelo's father guaranteed the Duke an annual income of $100,000 for life. And then there was the house. Consuelo's family spent another $2.5 million purchasing land in London and building Sunderland House, a palatial townhouse for the couple. All of this money flowed in one direction, from the American family to the British aristocrat. And what did Consuelo get? A title, the right to be called Duchess of Marlborough, and a husband who told her, on their honeymoon, that he had given up the Englishwoman he loved in order to collect her money. Can you imagine that? Your new husband, on your honeymoon, telling you he married you for cash and would have preferred someone else? But let me back up and tell you how Consuelo got to that altar in the first place, because the story is even worse than you might think. Consuelo was born in 1877 into unimaginable wealth. Her great-grandfather was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built an empire through shipping and railroads. By the time Consuelo was a teenager, the Vanderbilt fortune was one of the largest in America. She grew up in mansions, educated by the best tutors, groomed to be perfect. Her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, was ruthlessly ambitious. Alva had fought her way into New York high society through sheer force of will and extravagant spending. She threw parties that cost fortunes, built mansions that rivaled palaces, and slowly, grudgingly, won acceptance from the old money families who initially looked down on the Vanderbilts as vulgar upstarts. But Alva wanted more. She wanted a title for her daughter, not just any title, a duke, the highest rank below royalty. Consuelo, however, had other plans. She had fallen in love with a young American man named Winthrop Rutherford. He was handsome, kind, and from a respectable old New York family. He was part of the 400, the elite group that defined New York society. It would have been a perfect match. Consuelo wanted to marry him. She told her mother, and Alva said no. What happened next depends on whose account you believe, but this is what Consuelo later wrote in her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. When she refused to give up Winthrop and threatened to elope with him, Alva locked her in her room. A footman was posted at the door. Not even her governess was allowed in. Alva then told Consuelo that if she did not agree to marry the Duke, Alva would have Winthrop killed. She actually threatened to murder him. And then Alva claimed to be deathly ill. She took to her bed, called in doctors, and told Consuelo that her stubborn refusal to marry the Duke was literally killing her mother, that the stress was causing Alva's heart to fail. Faced with the threat of her lover being murdered and her mother dying, Consuelo broke. She agreed to the marriage. Miraculously, Alva made a full recovery almost immediately. On the morning of her wedding, Consuelo wrote in her diary, "I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone. No one came near me." She cried so much that the wedding had to be delayed 20 minutes so that the swelling around her eyes could go down enough for her veil to hide the evidence. And yet the wedding went forward. 2,000 guests attended. The press covered every detail. Alva had been leaking information to newspapers for weeks, building public excitement. She told reporters about the gold fastenings on Consuelo's undergarments, the 5-meter train on her wedding gown, the 75 custom dresses in her trousseau. She turned her daughter's misery into a media spectacle. Now, you might be wondering, why did this keep happening? If these marriages were so obviously unhappy, why did families continue arranging them? Because the social pressure was overwhelming. For American families, especially those with new money, a titled European son-in-law opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. It gave legitimacy. It meant invitations to court presentations, entry into exclusive social circles, acceptance by the old guard who had previously scorned them. And for the British aristocrats, well, the alternative was watching their ancestral homes crumble. Many of these estates had been in families for centuries. Losing them was unthinkable, so they married American heiresses, took their money, and tried to preserve their way of life. But here is what gets me about this entire system. The women involved had no say. Or rather, they were given a false choice. Marry this man we have selected for you, or be responsible for your family's social ruin or your mother's death, or the loss of generations of heritage. That is not a choice, that is coercion. And it was not just Consuelo. Let me tell you about a few other women caught in this system. Jenny Jerome, born in 1854, was called the first dollar princess. Her father was a wealthy American financier. In 1874, when she was just 20 years old, she married Lord Randolph Churchill, the third son of the Duke of Marlborough. The Churchill family initially opposed the match. Jenny was American, her father was nouveau riche, and she even had tattoos, which was considered scandalous. But when they calculated her dowry, £50,000 plus an annual allowance of £1,000, they changed their minds fast enough. Jenny's marriage was not particularly happy, but she made the best of it. She became a prominent London socialite, hosted influential political salons, and gave birth to Winston Churchill in November of 1874. Her money and her connections helped launch her son's political career. So in a strange way, this transactional marriage changed world history. Mary Leiter, daughter of a Chicago retail magnate who co-founded Marshall Field and Company, married George Curzon in 1895. Curzon later became Viceroy of India, the highest official title any American woman ever held in the British Empire. Mary's dowry helped preserve the Curzon family estates, and she threw herself into her role, becoming an effective and beloved vice-reign. But she died young, at age 36, possibly worn out by the demands of her position. And then there is Nancy Langhorne, who took a different path. After a disastrous first marriage that ended in divorce, she moved to London where she met and married Waldorf Astor, heir to a fortune. She became Lady Astor, and then in 1919 she became the first woman to sit in British Parliament. She was an American heiress who actually used her position for something beyond social climbing. She became a political force. But not all the stories end well, or even neutrally. Most of these marriages were unhappy. The American women found themselves isolated in cold, drafty English estates, far from their families, trapped in relationships with men who resented them even as they spent their money. English society looked down on them as vulgar Americans. Their husbands often had mistresses, and divorce was nearly impossible. Consuelo tried to make her marriage work. She had 2 sons, John in 1897 and Ivor in 1898. She later coined the phrase "an heir and a spare" to describe her duty to produce male children. But she and the Duke were fundamentally incompatible. He was cold, unfaithful, and openly contemptuous of her American background. She felt suffocated by English aristocratic life, by the snobbery, by the rigid social rules, by the dreary weather and even drearier dinners. She wrote in her memoir about how much she dreaded the nightly formal dinners with her husband. "How I learned to dread and hate these dinners," she said. "How ominous and wearisome they loomed at the end of a long day." The couple separated in 1906, just 11 years after their wedding, but they could not divorce. English law at the time required a man to prove only adultery in his wife, but a woman had to prove both adultery and physical cruelty. Since the Duke had not beaten Consuelo, she had no grounds for divorce, no matter how miserable the marriage made her. They lived separately for 15 years. Finally, in 1921, after changes in divorce law, they were able to end the marriage legally. And in 1926, the Vatican annulled it. To get the annulment, Alva Vanderbilt testified that she had coerced her daughter into the marriage. She admitted, on record, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." Can you imagine admitting that? That you had absolute power over another human being, that you forced her into marriage against her will? But Consuelo got the last word in a way. In 1921, less than a month after her divorce, she married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and industrialist. And this marriage was happy. They stayed together until his death in 1956. Consuelo finally got to marry for love, but only after enduring 26 years of a marriage she never wanted. Now, let me be clear about something. These women were privileged. They lived in luxury most people could not imagine. They had servants, beautiful clothes, travel, experiences that were completely out of reach for the vast majority of women. And yes, some of them did incredible things with their positions. They became philanthropists, political activists, cultural ambassadors. But privilege does not mean freedom, and luxury does not mean happiness. These women were still property. Expensive property, valuable property, property that came with silks and jewels and titles, but property nonetheless. Their families owned them until marriage. Then their husbands owned them. Their money became their husband's money. Their children became their husband's heirs. They themselves had almost no legal rights, and they had no choice in who they married. Oh, they might be allowed to meet a few carefully selected suitors. They might be asked their preference. But ultimately the decision was made by their families, based on financial and social calculations that had nothing to do with the women's own desires. This is what the marriage market looked like. Young women of a certain class were groomed from birth to be marriageable. They were educated just enough to be interesting conversationalists, but not so much that they would be threatening. They were taught to sing, to play piano, to speak French, to arrange flowers, to manage servants. They learned to sit properly, to walk gracefully, to never express a strong opinion in mixed company. And then, when they reached the appropriate age, usually 17 or 18, they were launched into society. In London, this meant being presented at court, wearing a white gown with a ridiculously long train and ostrich feathers in your hair, curtsying to the Queen. In New York, it meant your debut, a lavish party announcing your availability for marriage. And then the season began. A whirlwind of balls, dinners, theatre outings, all carefully orchestrated opportunities for young women to meet eligible men under the watchful eyes of their mothers and chaperones. The goal was simple: secure the best possible match before the season ended, and you had to try again next year. If you failed to marry within a few seasons, you became what was cruelly called a spinster. Your value on the marriage market declined. Your family's disappointment grew, the pressure intensified. So women married. They married men they barely knew. They married men they did not love. They married men who saw them as walking bank accounts or breeding stock, and they did it because they had been raised to believe this was their purpose, their duty, their destiny. The Belle Époque marriage market was efficient, I will give it that. It successfully redistributed American wealth to European aristocracy. It created social mobility for nouveau riche families. It preserved historic estates that might otherwise have been lost. But it destroyed how many lives? How many young women like Consuelo spent their wedding days crying? How many spent years in loveless marriages, separated from their families, trapped by law and custom and social expectation? We will never know the exact number, but we know it was not rare, it was the norm. And here is the truly maddening part. While wealthy women were being sold into marriage, other women were fighting for basic rights. The suffragette movement was growing. Women were demanding the vote, property rights, access to education and professions. And the same families who marched their daughters down the aisle to marry strangers often opposed these movements. They saw women's rights as dangerous, radical, a threat to the social order. The contradiction is stunning. We will trade our daughters like commodities, but heaven forbid they should want to vote. But change was coming, slowly, too slowly, but coming nonetheless. And we're going to talk about that change, about the women who refused to accept the roles assigned to them, who fought back in ways both large and small. Because while Consuelo Vanderbilt was crying at her wedding, other women were riding bicycles in bloomers, demanding education, forming clubs and organizations, building lives outside the traditional marriage plot. They were called the New Women, and they terrified the establishment. Let me introduce you to them next, to the rebels, the radicals, the women who looked at the gilded cage and said, "No, I will not go quietly into that prison, no matter how beautiful the bars." Here is a question I want you to consider. What if the thing that terrified men the most was not a sword, not a protest sign, not even a ballot box, but a bicycle? In 1896, Susan B. Anthony, the legendary American suffragist, made a statement that still resonates today. She said, "I think the bicycle has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives a woman a feeling of freedom and self-reliance." A bicycle, 2 wheels and a chain. That was the weapon that began to crack open the gilded cage we've been talking about for the last 5 parts of this story. And the establishment absolutely lost its mind. They invented a disease, an actual fake medical condition. They called it bicycle face. And they used it to try to terrify women into staying off their bicycles and staying in their place. Let me tell you about the women who looked at this absurd scare tactic and said, "Watch me ride anyway." Welcome to the rebellion. Welcome to the new woman of the Belle Époque. You have to understand what bicycles meant in practical terms. Before the 1880s, if you were a woman and you wanted to go somewhere, you had 3 options. You could walk, which was slow and limited to short distances. You could take a carriage, which required either owning one yourself or hiring one, both expensive options, or you could take public transportation, which was unreliable, crowded, and often unsafe for unaccompanied women. Then came the safety bicycle, invented in the 1880s and mass-produced by the 1890s. Unlike the earlier penny-farthing bicycles with one huge wheel and one tiny wheel that were dangerous and difficult to ride, the safety bicycle had two equal-size wheels, a chain drive, and a much lower centre of gravity. Anyone could learn to ride one, and women did, in droves. Suddenly, for the first time in history, ordinary women had independent mobility. You could get on your bicycle and go wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted, without asking permission from anyone. You did not need a chaperone. You did not need a male escort. You did not need money for a carriage. You just needed your bicycle. Think about what this meant. A young woman could ride to visit friends without her parents knowing exactly where she was every moment. She could go on dates with young men unchaperoned, something that would have been scandalous just years earlier. She could ride out into the countryside and experience solitude and independence. She could skip church on Sunday and go cycling instead, and nobody could stop her. The bicycle gave women physical freedom, and physical freedom led to everything else. But there was a problem. The clothing. Remember the corsets we talked about earlier? The layers and layers of petticoats, the long heavy skirts that dragged on the ground. You cannot ride a bicycle in that. The skirts would get caught in the wheels and chain. The corset would make it impossible to breathe while exerting yourself. The whole elaborate costume of Belle Époque femininity was completely incompatible with cycling. So women adapted. They started wearing bloomers. Now, bloomers had existed since the 1850s. They were named after Amelia Bloomer, an American women's rights advocate who published articles about dress reform in her newspaper, The Lily. The original bloomer costume consisted of a shorter skirt, knee-length, worn over loose Turkish-style trousers that gathered at the ankle. It was modest by modern standards, but in the 1850s, it was considered so scandalous that women who wore it faced mockery, harassment, and sometimes even violence. But by the 1890s, the bicycle gave women a legitimate, practical reason to wear bloomers or similar divided skirts. It was not just about making a political statement. It was about safety and comfort while cycling. And slowly, grudgingly, bloomers became acceptable, at least for cycling. And this is where it gets interesting, because the moment women started wearing bloomers, even just for cycling, the backlash was ferocious. Political cartoons appeared showing women in bloomers looking ugly, masculine, ridiculous. Newspapers published articles warning that bloomers would destroy femininity. Religious leaders preached that women wearing any form of trousers were violating God's law. And doctors, male doctors, overwhelmingly started inventing medical conditions supposedly caused by cycling. Let me tell you about bicycle face, because this is one of the most absurd moral panics in history. The term was probably coined by Dr. A. Shadwell, a British physician, in the mid-1890s. He wrote an article in 1897 for the National Review titled The Hidden Dangers of Cycling. In it, he described a terrifying new condition that afflicted women who cycle too much. The symptoms of bicycle face, according to various doctors and magazines of the time, included a flushed or pale complexion, drawn lips, dark circles under the eyes, a clenched jaw, bulging eyes, and a permanent expression of weariness or anxiety. Basically, they described what anyone looks like when they are concentrating on not falling off a bicycle, but they claimed this expression would become permanent, that the strain of cycling, the effort to maintain balance, the unnatural posture, would freeze a woman's face into this ugly, mannish, exhausted look. And what could be worse for a woman than losing her beauty? The Literary Digest published an article in September of 1895 that warned against excessive indulgence in wheeling because of the discovery of the alleged bicycle face by English medical papers. The Springfield Republican warned specifically that women, girls, and middle-aged men were particularly susceptible, and the warnings did not stop at bicycle face. Doctors claimed that cycling could cause all manner of medical problems in women: spinal curvature, nervous exhaustion, heart palpitations, infertility, uterine displacement. One doctor seriously argued that the bicycle saddle would teach young women to masturbate. Another claimed that cycling would make women walk in a masculine way because it overdeveloped certain muscles. The New York World published a list of don'ts for women cyclists in 1895 that is both hilarious and infuriating. Let me read you a few. May not be a fright. Don't faint on the road. Don't wear a man's cap. Don't cultivate a bicycle face. Don't boast of your long rides. Don't refuse assistance up a hill. Notice the underlying assumption in all of these warnings. Women should be attractive, delicate, dependent on men, and modest about their accomplishments. The bicycle threatened all of that. But here is the beautiful part. Women did not stop cycling. They pushed back. Dr. Sarah Hackett Stevenson, one of the first female physicians in America, publicly dismissed bicycle face in 1897. She wrote, "Cycling is not injurious to any part of the anatomy as it improves the general health. The painfully anxious facial expression is seen only among beginners and is due to the uncertainty of amateurs." In other words, yes, people learning to ride bicycles look concentrated and worried, because they are learning something new. Once they become proficient, they relax and enjoy it. Bicycle face was not a disease. It was fear-mongering disguised as medicine. And more women started writing about cycling from their own experience. Women like Mary Bisland, Mary Sargent Hopkins, and Emma Moffett Ting wrote articles and books promoting cycling for women. They argued that it strengthened muscles, improved circulation, provided fresh air and exercise, and most importantly, gave women confidence in their own physical capabilities. The bicycle created what became known as the New Woman. This was not just one person, but a cultural phenomenon, an ideal, an image of a modern woman who was educated, independent, physically active, and unafraid to challenge social conventions. In America, the most famous visual representation of the New Woman was the Gibson Girl, created by illustrator Charles Dana Gibson. The Gibson Girl wore her hair piled high on her head in a casual, natural style. She wore simple, tailored clothing, usually a white high-necked blouse and a full but practical skirt. She played sports. She rode bicycles, she went to college, she had opinions, and she expressed them. The Gibson Girl was confident without being aggressive, beautiful without being delicate, feminine without being helpless. And men found this both attractive and threatening. For 20 years, from the 1890s to the 1910s, Gibson's illustrations appeared in magazines, and the Gibson Girl became the ideal image of American womanhood. Young women copied her hairstyle, her clothing, her attitude. The Gibson Girl proved that you could be both respectable and active, both feminine and independent. In England, the Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881 by Viscountess Florence Harberton, promoted clothing that allowed women to move freely. Harberton herself was a cyclist and advocated for divided skirts and bloomers. The society argued that no woman should have to wear more than 7 pounds of underwear, which sounds like a lot to us, but was revolutionary at the time when women often wore 20 or 30 pounds of clothing. And Harberton fought for her beliefs. In October of 1898, she rode her bicycle to the Hautboy Hotel, wearing her bloomer cycling costume. The owner, A woman named Martha Sprague refused to serve her in the coffee room because of her clothing. Sprague insisted Harberton go to the bar where working men drank and smoked, essentially treating her like a common woman because she was wearing trousers. Harberton sued. The case went to court in April of 1899. Harberton argued that the hotel was legally obligated to serve her without discrimination based on her dress. Sprague argued she had not refused service, just directed Harberton to a different room because she did not allow women without skirts into the coffee room. The jury found in favour of Sprague. Harberton lost the case, but she won something more important. The case generated enormous publicity. Newspapers across England and America covered it, and it forced a public conversation about women's clothing, women's rights to public space, and women's freedom to dress for comfort rather than conformity. The bicycle also created practical changes in women's lives beyond just transportation. Cycling clubs formed where women could socialise, exercise and support each other. Women began participating in bicycle races and long-distance tours. Some women became professional cyclists, earning money and fame through a sport that had not existed for women a generation earlier. And the bicycle changed courtship. For the first time, young men and women could go on dates without constant supervision. A couple could ride their bicycles out into the countryside, stop for a picnic, talk privately, get to know each other away from parents and chaperones. This freedom was both liberating and scandalous. Joseph Bishop, a newspaperman, wrote in 1896 about the social and economic influence of the bicycle. He noted that parents who will not allow their daughters to accompany young men to the theatre without chaperonage allow them to go bicycle riding alone with young men. Why the double standard? Because bicycles were seen as wholesome, healthy outdoor activity. Going to the theatre was associated with sophistication and potential corruption. But bicycling, fresh air and exercise, it seemed innocent, and so parents allowed it, not fully realizing that they were giving their daughters unprecedented freedom to develop relationships on their own terms. The New Woman phenomenon extended beyond bicycles and bloomers, of course. Women were entering universities in growing numbers. They were joining the workforce in professional capacities, not just as servants or factory workers, but as teachers, nurses, secretaries, shop clerks. They were forming clubs and organizations focused on everything from literature to social reform to political activism. The suffragette movement was gaining strength. Women were demanding the right to vote, to own property in their own names, to control their own money, to have legal rights in marriage and divorce. And the bicycle became a symbol of all of this. A woman on a bicycle was a woman who was going somewhere, literally and figuratively. But I do not want to romanticize this too much. The New Woman was still a minority. Most women, especially working-class women, did not have the time, money, or social freedom to embrace this lifestyle. If you were a seamstress working 16 hours a day, you were not cycling for pleasure. If you were a farm wife with 6 children and endless chores, you were not joining cycling clubs. The New Woman was primarily a phenomenon of the middle and upper classes. Women who had some education, some leisure time, some financial resources, and even among this group, the women who fully embraced the New Woman ideal faced serious consequences. If you cut your hair short, wore bloomers in public, or expressed radical political views, you risked being ostracized. You might be fired from your job. You might lose marriage prospects. You might be mocked in newspapers and cartoons. You might even be institutionalized if your family decided your behavior was evidence of mental illness. And yet, despite all of this, the movement grew. Because once you've experienced freedom, even a small taste of it, it is very hard to go back to the cage willingly. The New Woman challenged everything the Belle Époque stood for. The Belle Époque celebrated ornate femininity, delicate beauty, women as decorative objects. The New Woman said no, I am strong, I am capable. I'm a person with agency and rights. I will wear practical clothing. I will exercise my body. I will educate my mind. I will participate in public life. And the bicycle made this visible in a way that was impossible to ignore. Every woman riding down the street on her bicycle was a moving, living challenge to traditional gender roles. She was proving that women did not need men to transport them, that women were not too delicate for physical exertion, that women could navigate public space independently. The bicycle was not just transportation, it was a declaration of independence. Now, did the bicycle single-handedly emancipate women? Of course not. Susan B. Anthony was speaking metaphorically when she said it did more than anything else. The fight for women's rights required decades of activism, legislation, social change, but the bicycle was part of that change. It was a tool, and tools matter. Because here is what I think the bicycle really did. It allowed women to experience autonomy in their own bodies, in their daily lives, in small but significant ways. And that experience, that feeling of I can do this myself, I can go where I want, I can choose, that feeling was revolutionary. And once you feel it, you start asking other questions. If I can ride a bicycle without male supervision, why can I not vote? If I can navigate city streets on my own, why can I not manage my own money? If my body is strong enough to cycle 20 miles, why am I told I am too delicate for higher education or professional work? The bicycle opened a door, and behind that door were all the other freedoms women were fighting for. But even as some women were finding freedom through bicycles and bloomers and new opportunities, other women were facing a very different reality. A reality where the ability to create new life was also the most dangerous thing a woman could do. We need to talk about childbirth, about the silent epidemic that killed more women than tuberculosis, about the medical ignorance and arrogance that turned what should have been a natural process into a death sentence for thousands of women every year. The new woman could ride a bicycle, but she still faced the same risk every woman in the Belle Époque faced when she became pregnant. And that risk was enormous. Let me tell you about that next. About the hidden death toll of the beautiful era. About the women who died bringing life into the world. About the medical establishment that failed them catastrophically. Because if you think bicycle face was the worst thing doctors did to women in this era, you have not heard about what happened in maternity wards. Walk through any old cemetery anywhere in Europe or America, and you will find them. Rows of gravestones marking the deaths of young women. 22 years old, 19, 25, and if you look closely at the dates, you will often see a pattern. A woman dies, and within days, sometimes the same day, a tiny grave appears next to hers. Mother and child buried together. In 1900, childbirth was the second leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. The first was tuberculosis. Think about that. After infectious disease, the most dangerous thing that a woman could do was give birth. And this was not in some remote village without medical care. This was happening in Paris, in London, in New York, in the most advanced, most modern, most supposedly civilized cities in the world. Women were dying in hospitals. Women were dying with doctors present. Women were dying despite everything Belle Époque medicine claimed to offer. Let me tell you why. And I warn you, this is going to make you angry. The statistics are staggering. In 1900 in the United States, approximately 600 to 850 women died for every 100,000 live births. That means roughly one woman out of every 150 who gave birth would die. And remember, women in this era typically had 5, 6, or 7 children. So over a lifetime, every woman faced that risk multiple times. Do the math. If you had 6 children, your cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth was around 4%. 1 in 25. Those are terrible odds for something that was supposed to be natural. But here is what makes it worse. We had the knowledge to prevent most of these deaths. The scientific understanding existed. Doctors knew, or should have known, what caused maternal death and how to prevent it. But they did not apply that knowledge, and women died because of medical arrogance, institutional inertia, and outright sexism. Let me tell you about Ignaz Semmelweis, because his story is both heartbreaking and infuriating. In the 1840s, Semmelweis was a doctor at the Vienna General Hospital, which had the largest maternity ward in the world at the time, and they had a problem. Women were dying of puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, at shocking rates. This was an infection that developed within days of giving birth. It caused high fever, extreme pain, and usually death within a week. The Vienna hospital had 2 maternity clinics. The first clinic was run by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was run by midwives. And here is the strange thing that everyone noticed but nobody could explain. The death rate in the first clinic, the one run by doctors, was 3 times higher than in the second clinic run by midwives. Women begged not to be admitted to the first clinic. They knew something was wrong. They would rather give birth in the street than in the doctor's clinic because their chances of survival were better. Semmelweis became obsessed with figuring out why. What was different? And then, in 1847, one of his colleagues died. A doctor named Jakob Kolletschka cut his finger during an autopsy and developed symptoms identical to puerperal fever. He died within days. Semmelweis had his answer. The doctors in the first clinic were performing autopsies in the morning and then going directly to the maternity ward to examine labouring women without washing their hands. They were carrying cadaveric particles, bits of dead tissue and infection, from corpses directly into the birth canal of living women. They were killing their patients. The midwives in the second clinic did not perform autopsies. Their hands were clean. That was the difference. Semmelweis immediately instituted a new policy. Doctors had to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before examining patients. The death rate in the first clinic plummeted. It dropped by 90% almost overnight. Semmelweis had discovered antisepsis decades before germ theory was widely accepted. He had proven with data that hand washing saved lives. He published his findings in 1848, and the medical establishment rejected him. They rejected him because his findings implied that doctors were responsible for patient deaths. And doctors, educated gentlemen, could not possibly be the cause of disease. That was unthinkable. It was an insult to their honour and their profession. Other doctors refused to wash their hands. They mocked Semmelweis. They said he was obsessed, paranoid. Eventually he had a nervous breakdown from the stress of watching women die from something he knew how to prevent but could not convince other doctors to take seriously. He died in an asylum in 1865, beaten by guards, essentially killed by the same medical establishment he had tried to reform. And for decades after his death, women continued to die of puerperal fever because doctors refused to accept that hand washing mattered. Think about how many women died unnecessarily, how many children lost their mothers, how many families were destroyed, all because of medical pride. Hand washing, that is all it took, soap and water, or chlorine solution, something so simple a child could do it. And doctors would not do it because it hurt their feelings. Now, let me tell you what actually killed women in childbirth. Because there were 3 main causes: puerperal fever, which we just discussed; hemorrhage, uncontrolled bleeding during or after delivery; and toxemia, what we now call eclampsia, a dangerous spike in blood pressure that causes seizures. All 3 of these conditions could be prevented or treated with proper medical care. But proper medical care often did not exist, especially for poor women. If you were wealthy, you gave birth at home with a doctor in attendance and a team of servants to help. If you were middle class, you might have a doctor or you might have a midwife. If you were poor, you gave birth alone or with the help of a neighbour, and if there were complications, you died. But here is the cruel irony. Wealthy women with doctors actually had a higher mortality rate than poor women with midwives for much of this period. Why? Because doctors interfered too much. Doctors in the Belle Époque were trained to intervene. They used forceps aggressively. They performed procedures that increased the risk of infection. They gave medications that were sometimes more harmful than helpful. And again, they did not wash their hands. Midwives, on the other hand, generally took a more hands-off approach. They let labour proceed naturally unless there was a clear problem. And because they were not also doing autopsies or surgery, their hands were cleaner. There is a particularly grim example from the United States. In the early 1900s, maternal mortality rates in hospitals were actually higher than home birth rates. Women who could afford hospital births were more likely to die than women who gave birth at home. Because hospitals were where doctors congregated, where procedures were performed, where infections spread. This did not start to change until the 1930s and 40s, when antibiotics were introduced. Sulfur drugs in the late 1930s and penicillin in the 1940s finally gave doctors a way to treat infections effectively, and suddenly maternal mortality dropped like a stone. But in 1900, in the heart of the Belle Époque, none of that existed yet. Women just died, and it was considered tragic but inevitable. Except it was not inevitable. Other countries were doing better. Sweden, for example, had professionalised midwifery and had a maternal mortality rate less than half of what the United States had. They required midwives to be trained and certified. They collected data on outcomes, they identified problems and fixed them. But in places like the United States and Britain, medical care was fragmented, unregulated, and often dangerous. Now I want to talk about the experience of actually giving birth in this era, because it was terrifying even if everything went well. Labour could last for days. Women endured wave after wave of contractions with limited pain relief. The most common form of anaesthesia was chloroform or ether, administered by dripping it onto a cloth held over the woman's nose and mouth. This was dangerous. Too little, and it did not help. Too much, and it could kill the mother or the baby or both. Queen Victoria famously used chloroform when she gave birth to Prince Leopold in 1853. Her doctor, John Snow, carefully monitored the dose, but most women did not have access to such careful medical supervision, and there were documented cases of women and babies dying from anaesthesia overdoses. If labour did not progress, doctors might use forceps to pull the baby out. Forceps are essentially large metal tongs that grip the baby's head. In skilled hands, they can save lives. In unskilled hands, they can crush a baby's skull or tear the mother's tissues, leading to hemorrhage or infection. And then there was the caesarean section. Today, a caesarean is a routine surgery. In 1900, it was a desperate last resort, almost always fatal to the mother. The surgical techniques were crude, the risk of infection was enormous, and there was no effective way to control bleeding. Most doctors would only perform a caesarean if the mother was already dying and there was a chance to save the baby. The mother's survival was not expected. There were also horrifying stories of obstructed labour, where the baby simply could not fit through the birth canal. In these cases, if a caesarean was not possible or not attempted, doctors would sometimes perform a craniotomy. They would crush the baby's skull while it was still in the birth canal in order to remove it and save the mother's life. Imagine being a woman facing this possibility. Imagine knowing that if your labour did not go well, you might die, or your baby might die, or both, and there was nothing you could do about it except pray and hope. Superstitions abounded because people had no other way to make sense of the danger. It was believed that if a pregnant woman looked at something frightening, her baby would be marked or deformed. If she had an unsatisfied craving, she might miscarry. If she looked at the moon, her child might become a lunatic. These beliefs were absurd, but they gave people the illusion of control in a situation where they had none. The reality was that childbirth was a lottery. Some women sailed through it with no problems, others suffered and died, and nobody could predict which would be which. And if a woman survived childbirth, she was not out of danger. The weeks after giving birth were almost as dangerous as the birth itself. Puerperal fever could strike days or even weeks later. Hemorrhage could occur postpartum. Infections could develop. Women were told to stay in bed for weeks after giving birth, which actually increased the risk of blood clots. One particularly cruel aspect of this era was that doctors often blamed women for their own deaths. If a woman died in childbirth, it was because her constitution was weak, or she had not followed medical advice, or she had engaged in improper behavior during pregnancy. It was rarely acknowledged that the doctor's unwashed hands or aggressive interventions might have been the cause. There is a story that has stayed with me. In the early 1900s, a young woman in London gave birth to her first child with a doctor in attendance. She developed puerperal fever and died within a week. The doctor in his notes wrote that she had a weak constitution and was predisposed to infection. He took no responsibility. Years later, after antibiotics became available, someone reviewed those old medical records. They calculated that if the doctor had simply washed his hands and not performed an unnecessary internal examination during labour, that woman probably would have lived. One woman, one preventable death. Multiply that by thousands, by tens of thousands, and you begin to understand the scale of this tragedy. In the United States alone, it is estimated that between 1850 and 1930, hundreds of thousands of women died in childbirth from causes that could have been prevented with proper hygiene and medical care. That is not a natural death toll. That is a failure of medicine and society, and nobody talked about it. Maternal death was private, domestic, female. It did not make the newspapers unless the woman was famous. It was not studied systematically. It was not treated as a public health crisis. Women just died, and new women took their place. Do you know what finally changed things? Data, and women demanding better. In the 1910s and 20s, public health advocates, many of them women, started collecting systematic data on maternal mortality. They published reports showing that the United States had one of the worst maternal mortality rates in the developed world. They showed that black women died at rates 2 to 3 times higher than white women. They showed that poor women died more often than rich women, but that rich women were also dying at unacceptable rates. And they demanded change. They pushed for the professionalization of midwifery. They advocated for prenatal care. They called for better medical training and hospital standards. And slowly, painfully slowly, things began to improve. But in 1900, in the Belle Époque, none of this had happened yet. Women were still dying in huge numbers, and the beautiful era, with all its fashion and art and culture and progress, was built on a foundation of women's suffering and death. I think about the women we talked about in earlier parts of this story. Consuelo Vanderbilt had 2 children and survived. But how many of her friends, her cousins, her acquaintances did not? How many of the seamstresses who made those beautiful gowns died in childbirth with no one to remember them? How many new women riding their bicycles died, giving birth to the next generation? We will never know the exact number, but we know it was far too many. The Belle Époque celebrated motherhood. Art depicted mothers and children in soft, glowing, idealized scenes. Society praised women for fulfilling their biological destiny. Magazines published articles about proper maternal behavior and the joys of child rearing. But nobody talked about the women who died. Nobody counted them. Nobody mourned them collectively. They were just individual tragedies, private griefs, expected losses. And that silence, that acceptance, that is almost as cruel as the deaths themselves. Because we could have done better. The knowledge existed. The solutions were available. We just did not value women's lives enough to implement them. So when you think about the Belle Époque, when you see those beautiful photographs of elegant women in magnificent gowns, remember the other side. Remember the women who died bringing new life into this supposedly civilized world. Remember that beauty built on suffering is not really beautiful at all. But let me end this section with a note of hope, because change did come. By the 1950s, maternal mortality in developed countries had dropped by more than 95% from 1900 levels. Antibiotics, better surgical techniques, blood transfusions, improved prenatal care, all of these made childbirth dramatically safer. Today, in wealthy countries, maternal death is rare. Tragic when it happens, but rare. We have Semmelweis and the countless doctors and nurses and public health advocates who finally listened, finally cared enough to change things. But that change came too late for the women of the Belle Époque, and we should remember them. Now, while some women were dying in childbirth, other women were creating the very things that defined the Belle Époque. The gowns, the glamour, the fashion that made this era famous. But here is something fascinating. The designers who created these iconic looks. Many of them were women, and their stories have been almost completely erased from fashion history. Let me tell you about the women who dressed the Belle Époque. The designers, the entrepreneurs, the businesswomen who built fashion empires and then watched as history forgot their names and gave credit to men instead. Because the erasure of women from history did not just happen in childbirth statistics, it happened everywhere, and the fashion industry is a perfect example. Quick question. When you think of Belle Époque fashion, who do you think of? If you know anything about fashion history, you probably think of Charles Frederick Worth, the father of haute couture. Maybe you think of Paul Poiret, the revolutionary designer who freed women from corsets. Both men, both famous, both remembered. But what if I told you that before 1900, the vast majority of fashion designers were women? That women invented haute couture, created the fashion show, built international fashion empires worth millions, and then somehow we just forgot about them. This is the story of how women created the Belle Époque's most defining feature and then were systematically erased from the history books. And it is going to make you wonder what else we have been taught wrong. Let me introduce you to Jeanne Paquin. In 1891, when she was just 22 years old, she and her husband Isidore took over a struggling menswear shop on Rue de la Paix in Paris. Within a decade, she had transformed it into one of the most prestigious fashion houses in the world. Paquin was a genius. She understood that fashion was not just about making beautiful clothes. It was about creating an experience, a brand, a lifestyle, and she invented techniques that every fashion house still uses today. She created the Mannequin Parade, which was the first fashion show. Before Paquin, if you wanted to see designs, you looked at illustrations or you went to a showroom where dresses hung on racks. Paquin said no, that is boring. She hired professional models, trained them to walk gracefully, and staged theatrical presentations with lighting, music, and printed programs. She turned viewing clothes into entertainment. Think about that. Every fashion show you've ever seen, from Paris Fashion Week to Project Runway, originated with Jeanne Paquin in the 1890s. She also pioneered international expansion. She opened branches in London in 1896, Madrid and Buenos Aires. She created a fashion empire that spanned continents at a time when most businesses were local. Her designs were distinctive. She loved colour. While other designers were using pastels and whites, Paquin used bold, vibrant colours. She became famous for black evening gowns with colourful linings and embroidery. She combined silk with fur in ways that were shocking and gorgeous, and she understood branding. She signed an exclusive contract with Gazette du Bon Ton in 1912, one of the most prestigious fashion magazines. Her designs appeared in Vogue regularly. She knew that visibility was everything. In 1900, she was elected president of the fashion section of the Universal Exhibition in Paris. The Universal Exhibition was the biggest event of the year, showcasing the best of everything from around the world. And Paquin was chosen to represent French fashion, not worth, not a man. Paquin. In 1913, she became the first woman to receive the French Legion of Honor for her contributions to fashion. The French government recognized her as a pioneer, an innovator, someone who had elevated French culture globally. A New York Times reporter in 1913 called her the most commercial artist alive. She was making money hand over fist. After her husband died in 1907, she ran the business alone and it continued to thrive. She was a millionaire, a self-made businesswoman in an era when women were supposed to be dependent on men. So why have most people never heard of her? Let me tell you about another forgotten woman, Lucille, whose real name was Lady Duff Gordon. Lucille was British, born in 1863. She had a disastrous first marriage that ended in divorce, leaving her with a daughter to support and no money. So she started making clothes, and she was brilliant at it. Lucille invented the concept of sensual, luxurious lingerie. Before her, underwear was purely functional. Lucille said no, underwear should be beautiful. She created silk and lace lingerie in soft, romantic colours with names like A Frolic in the Snow and Dreams of Pleasure. She marketed fantasy and desire. She also pioneered the tea gown, a semi-formal dress that women could wear at home without a corset. It was comfortable, beautiful, and slightly scandalous because it suggested relaxation and sensuality. Wealthy women bought them by the dozens, but Lucille's real innovation was in how she presented fashion. She created what she called emotional fashion shows. She would design an entire collection around a theme, a story, and then stage it with theatrical lighting, carefully choreographed models, and even costumes for the audience. She also understood celebrity culture before it existed. She dressed actresses, socialites, anyone who could generate publicity, and she knew how to create scandal. She introduced slit skirts that showed a bit of ankle. She designed low necklines that were considered daring. And people talked about her constantly, which meant they bought her clothes. Lucille survived the Titanic disaster in 1912. She was on the ship with her husband when it sank. They both survived, but Lucille was criticized in the press for allegedly pushing other people aside to get into a lifeboat. The scandal followed her for years, but she used it. She wrote about her experiences, she gave interviews, she stayed visible. By 1915, she had salons in London and Paris, New York and Chicago. She was an international brand, and she did it all without formal training, without capital, starting from nothing after a divorce. So why is she not as famous as Worth or Poiret? Here is the pattern I want you to notice. Before 1900, women dominated fashion design. There was a royal edict in France dating back to 1675 that officially recognized the rights of female dressmakers. For centuries, making clothes was women's work. Men were tailors who made menswear. Women made women's clothing. But then fashion became profitable. Really profitable. And suddenly, men wanted in. Charles Frederick Worth is often called the father of haute couture. He opened his house in Paris in 1858, and he revolutionized fashion by putting his name on his designs, by dictating to clients what they should wear instead of the other way around. He turned designers into artists instead of servants. But here is what the history books often leave out. Worth did not work alone. His wife Marie Vernet was essential to his success. She modelled his designs, she helped develop them. She had exquisite taste and understood what wealthy women wanted. But Worth got all the credit, and as fashion became more prestigious and more profitable, more men entered the field. By the 1920s and 30s, men dominated the fashion houses that everyone remembers. Chanel was an exception, and even she had to fight constantly to be taken seriously. So what happened to Paquin and Lucille and all the other women designers? Paquin's house continued after her death in 1936, but it was eventually absorbed by other companies. The name faded. Lucille's business collapsed in the 1920s, partly due to financial mismanagement and partly due to changing taste after World War I. She died in obscurity in 1935, and fashion history, as it was written, mostly by men in the mid-20th century, focused on the male designers. Worth, Poiret, later Dior and Saint Laurent. The women were footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. Let me tell you about one more woman who deserves to be remembered. Jeanne Margaine Lacroix. Her mother, Armandine Fresnays Margaine, founded the House of Margaine in 1868. The house won a gold medal at the Paris Universal Exhibition of 1889. When Armandine died in 1899, her daughter Jeanne took over and renamed it Margaine Lacroix. Jeanne designed for royalty. She created gowns for Princess Alexandra of Denmark. Empress Eugénie wore her designs. She dressed some of the most famous courtesans and actresses of the Belle Époque, including Sarah Bernhardt. There is a dress in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London that Jeanne designed around 1900. It is made of figured satin decorated with imitation pearls, diamantes and spangles. It is a work of art. Hundreds of hours of labour went into it, and most people who see it have no idea who made it. These women were not just making pretty dresses, they were running businesses, managing employees, negotiating with suppliers, marketing their brands, handling finances. They were entrepreneurs in an era when women were not supposed to be capable of business, and they employed thousands of other women. Remember the seamstresses we talked about earlier? Many of them worked for these fashion houses. Yes, the conditions were often terrible, but the houses run by women like Paquin tended to be slightly better than those run by men. Not good, but better. There is historical evidence that Paquin paid her workers more than some other houses, that she was more willing to give time off. Was she a perfect employer? No, but she understood what it was like to be a woman trying to survive in a system designed against you. Now, I want to address something important. These women were not feminists in the modern sense. They were not marching for suffrage or demanding equal rights in loud public ways. Paquin was actually quite careful to maintain a respectable feminine image. She knew that if she was too radical, too threatening, men would destroy her business. But they were feminists in action. They proved that women could run international businesses. They proved that women could innovate. They created spaces where other women could work and learn and develop skills. And they did it while navigating a system that was stacked against them at every turn. Think about what it took. These women had to be brilliant at design. They had to understand business and finance. They had to manage personnel. They had to negotiate with suppliers who often did not want to deal with women. They had to attract clients in a world where wealthy women often preferred to say they bought from a male designer because it sounded more prestigious. They had to be perfect, better than the men, and even then, history forgot them. There is a photo I have seen of Jeanne Paquin standing in her salon around 1900. She is wearing one of her own designs, elegant and confident. Behind her are mannequins displaying her collection, and if you look closely at her face, there is something in her expression. Pride, yes, but also a kind of defiance. She knew what she was up against, and she did it anyway. In 1917, during World War I, seamstresses from Paquin and other fashion houses went on strike. They demanded better wages and reduced working hours, and Paquin, to her credit, negotiated with them. She did not have the workers beaten or arrested like some employers did. She talked to them, she made some concessions. Was it enough? No, but it was something. After World War I, fashion changed dramatically. The elaborate, corseted, layered looks of the Belle Époque went out of style. Women wanted simpler, more practical clothes. Shorter skirts, looser fits, designs that reflected the reality of women who now worked in offices and factories. The fashion houses that adapted survived. Those that did not, did not. Many of the women-owned houses struggled because they were associated with the old ways. And male designers like Poiret and later Chanel and Dior captured the new mood. By the 1950s, when fashion historians started writing the official history of haute couture, most of the women designers had been dead for decades. Their houses had closed or been absorbed. There was no one left to advocate for their place in history, and so the narrative became that Charles Frederick Worth invented haute couture, that men had always dominated high fashion, that women were clients and muses, but not creators. It is only recently, in the last few decades, that fashion historians have started to recover these women's stories, to acknowledge that before the men took over, women built this industry. Here is what I find most infuriating about this erasure. The Belle Époque was defined by fashion. It was what the era was known for, what made it beautiful, and women created that beauty. They designed it, they sewed it, they styled it, they sold it. But when we talk about the Belle Époque, we talk about the women who wore the clothes, not the women who made them. We remember the courtesans and the society ladies and the actress. We remember the men who designed for them. The women who actually built the fashion industry are ghosts. Jeanne Paquin died in 1936. Her obituary in the fashion press was respectful, noting her achievements, but within a generation she was forgotten. Today, if you mention her name to most people, even people interested in fashion, they will not know who you are talking about. Lucille died broke and forgotten in 1935. She had spent the last years of her life trying to restart her business, writing magazine articles, anything to survive. The woman who addressed royalty and survived the Titanic died in obscurity. This is the price women paid for creating beautiful things in a world that did not want to admit women could be brilliant. But we can remember them now, we can tell their stories, we can acknowledge that the Belle Époque's beauty was created largely by women, and that those women deserve to be part of history. And as we move forward in this story, as we talk about the women who performed on the stages of the Belle Époque, I want you to keep this pattern in mind. Women creating, men taking credit. Women innovating, men being remembered. Women building, men erasing. Because the women who danced and sang in the cabarets and theatres of Paris, they also built the entertainment industry of the Belle Époque. They also made fortunes and changed culture. And their stories too have been half forgotten, romanticized, sanitized. Let me tell you about the performers next. About the dancers who made Moulin Rouge famous. About the actresses who were more than just beautiful faces. About the women who turned spectacle into power and paid a terrible price for it. Because if you think the fashion designers had it hard, wait until you hear about the women who dared to perform in public. Picture this. It is 11 o'clock at night in Paris, 1895. The Moulin Rouge is packed with people. Tourists, aristocrats, artists, everyone crammed together in clouds of cigarette smoke and champagne fumes. The band starts playing. The lights focus on the stage, and then she appears. Her name is Jane Avril. She is 26 years old, and when she dances, people cannot look away. Jane does not dance like the other can-can dancers. She does not kick high or flash her underwear at the audience, though that is what sells tickets. Instead, she moves like water, like smoke, like something otherworldly. Her arms float. Her body twists in ways that should not be possible. And her face stays completely expressionless, almost haunted. The crowd goes silent when she dances, and when she finishes, they explode. Toulouse-Lautrec, the artist, becomes obsessed with her. He paints her dozens of times, creates posters of her that become iconic images of the Belle Époque. In one famous poster, she is dancing alone, her leg raised, her dress swirling, and there is something in her posture that is both elegant and slightly unhinged. Because here is what most people do not know about Jane Avril. She spent part of her childhood in an asylum. She suffered from a neurological condition that caused involuntary movements. Doctors called it hysteria. Today, we would recognize it as Sydenham's chorea, a movement disorder often associated with rheumatic fever. Dancing was her cure. Moving on stage let her control the movements that had controlled her. The spasms that had made her an outcast became art when she framed them in performance. She danced at the Moulin Rouge for over 20 years, made a fortune, lost it, made it again, and when she died in 1943 during the Nazi occupation of Paris, she died poor and mostly forgotten. But for 2 decades at the turn of the century she was a star. This is the other side of Belle Époque performance. Glamorous, yes, profitable sometimes, but also dangerous, exploitative, and built on the bodies of women who often had no other options. Let me tell you about the world these women inhabited. The cabarets, the theatres, the music halls of the Belle Époque, and the women who made them famous. The Moulin Rouge opened in 1889, the same year as the Eiffel Tower and the Universal Exhibition. It was designed to be a spectacle, a giant red windmill on top, an enormous dance floor, a garden with a giant plaster elephant that housed a belly dancing show inside. This was not subtle entertainment. The main attraction was the can-can, which was technically illegal. French law prohibited displays of obscenity in public, and the can-can, with its high kicks and exposed petticoats and occasionally exposed bodies, definitely qualified as obscene. But the police looked the other way because the Moulin Rouge brought in tourist money. Rich foreigners, especially British and Americans, loved the forbidden thrill of watching French women dance in ways that would get you arrested in London or New York. So the Moulin Rouge paid fines occasionally but mostly operated freely. The can-can dancers were celebrities. La Goulou, whose real name was Louise Weber, was the biggest star. She was crude, vulgar, and absolutely magnetic. She would kick men's hats off their heads. She once lifted her leg so high she knocked a drink out of the Prince of Wales's hand. The audience loved her for it. La Goulou made enormous amounts of money at her peak. Contemporary accounts suggest she earned around 500 francs per performance, which was more than what a seamstress made in 6 months. She wore diamonds. She had lovers among the aristocracy. She lived large. And then her body gave out. Can-can dancing is brutal on the body. Hours of rehearsal, multiple performances per night, high kicks, splits, back bends, all in heavy costumes. La Goulou's knees and back deteriorated. By her mid-30s, she could not dance anymore. She tried to reinvent herself as a lion tamer. Yes, really, she bought a cage and some lions and performed at fairs. It did not go well. The lions were not well trained, and audiences did not care about a former dancer wrestling animals. Lagulu died in poverty in 1929, selling matches on the street corners of Paris. The woman who had danced for royalty, who had been painted by Toulouse-Lautrec, who had made enough money to buy diamonds, died destitute because there was no safety net, no retirement, no system to help performers whose bodies broke down. Think about that trajectory, from the biggest stages in Paris to selling matches in the street. And this was not unusual. This was the standard path for performers who did not successfully transition to something else. Let me tell you about another kind of performer, the actresses. Sarah Bernhardt was the most famous actress of the Belle Époque. She was brilliant, theatrical, and absolutely shameless about self-promotion. She slept in a coffin to prepare for tragic roles and made sure journalists knew about it. She toured internationally, playing to sold-out crowds in Europe, America, and even Australia. She was one of the first global celebrities. But Sarah Bernhardt was exceptional. Most actresses had very different experiences. If you were an actress in the Belle Époque, your career depended entirely on your looks and your willingness to please powerful men. Theatre owners, directors, critics, wealthy patrons, all of them expected sexual access. If you refused, you did not get roles. It was that simple. There was a well-known system in Paris theatres where wealthy men could purchase access backstage. They would pay the theatre for the privilege of meeting actresses in their dressing rooms after performances. This was considered completely normal and acceptable, and actresses were caught in an impossible position. If they had affairs with wealthy patrons, they were called prostitutes. If they refused, they were called difficult and did not get work. There was no way to win. Réjeanne, whose real name was Gabrielle Réjou, was one of the most talented actresses of the era. She was known for her ability to disappear into roles, to make audiences believe completely in whatever character she was playing. Critics praised her technique. Other actresses studied her methods. But Réjeanne also had to navigate the system. She had affairs with wealthy men who supported her career. She was careful about which ones she chose, trying to find patrons who actually respected her talent and would not just use her and discard her. But the need to have patrons at all, the fact that her talent alone was not enough, that was the constant reality. In her memoirs, written late in life, Réjeanne talked about the additional duties of being an actress. She did not use the word prostitution, but she made it clear that sexual availability was expected and that refusing could end a career before it started. Now, let me talk about a performer who fascinates me because she turned the whole system on its head. Cléo de Merode. Cléo was a ballet dancer at the Paris Opera, which sounds prestigious, and it was, but it was also deeply corrupt. The Paris Opera in the Belle Époque had a practice called the abonnement. Wealthy men could purchase season tickets that included not just seats at performances, but also access to a special room backstage where they could meet the ballerinas. This was institutionalized grooming. Many of these ballerinas were teenagers, 13, 14, 15 years old. And wealthy men, some in their 50s or 60s, were given official access to them. The expectation was that ballerinas would become mistresses to these men, who would support them financially. The ballerinas' salaries from the opera were deliberately kept low to make them dependent on patrons. It was a system designed to exploit young girls. Cléo de Merode refused to play along. She was beautiful, extraordinarily so. Her face appeared on postcards and advertisements everywhere. She was one of the most photographed women in the world at the turn of the century, and she used that fame to create independence. Cléo made money from endorsements. She was one of the first performers to understand that her image had commercial value beyond performing. She endorsed products, posed for photographs, and leveraged her beauty into financial security that did not require a patron. There were constant rumours that she was having affairs with royalty. She was linked to King Leopold II of Belgium, among others. Cleo always denied these rumours, and there is no concrete evidence they were true. But the rumours themselves show how society could not accept that a woman might succeed on her own terms. If a woman was successful, people assumed she must have slept her way there. The idea that Cleo was simply smart, beautiful, and good at business was apparently impossible to believe. Cleo lived to be 100 years old. She died in 1966, having outlived almost everyone from the Belle Époque. And in her later years, she wrote about the Paris opera and the abonnement system with barely concealed disgust. She described it as legalized trafficking of young girls. But here is the thing that gets me. While the abonnement system was happening, while teenage ballerinas were being delivered to old men in a room backstage, society was celebrating the Paris opera as the pinnacle of culture and civilization. People went to the opera to see art, to demonstrate their sophistication, to participate in high culture. And in the same building, in rooms they walked past, girls were being exploited. And everyone knew. It was not a secret. It was just accepted. Do you see the pattern? Entertainment in the Belle Époque was built on the exploitation of women's bodies. Dancers, actresses, singers, they all existed in this space where they could become famous, could make money, could even achieve a kind of power. But they did it at enormous personal cost and with almost no protection. Let me tell you about the Folies Bergères, another famous venue. The Folies Bergères was known for its elaborate productions. They had dancers, acrobats, singers, all performing in spectacular costumes with elaborate sets. The shows were famous for their nudity. Bare breasts were legal in France as long as the performers stayed perfectly still, categorized as living statues rather than dancers. So the Folies Bergères featured tableaux vivants, living pictures, where nearly naked women would pose motionless in elaborate scenes. Greek mythology was popular. Biblical scenes, historical recreations, anything that gave an excuse for nudity while maintaining a veneer of artistic respectability. The women who performed in these tableaux were paid very little. They were not considered real performers. They were just bodies on display, and many of them supplemented their income through prostitution because their wages were not enough to live on. Édouard Manet painted one of the most famous artworks of the Belle Époque at the Folies Bergères. It is called A Bar at the Folies Bergères, painted in 1882. It shows a barmaid standing behind the bar, looking directly at the viewer, with the reflection of the crowd behind her in the mirror. The painting is beautiful and sad. The barmaid's face is expressionless, almost dead inside. And if you know the context, you understand why. Barmaids at the Folies Bergères were expected to entertain customers, which often meant accepting drinks, flirting, and sometimes more. They were serving drinks and also selling themselves. Manet captured that exhaustion, that emotional numbness in the woman's face. She is surrounded by pleasure and spectacle, but she is not part of it. She is working. She is surviving. Now, not every performer's story was tragic. Some women did manage to build successful, sustainable careers. Some married well and left the stage. Some, like Cleo, created financial independence through smart business decisions. But the system was designed against them, and the majority of women who performed in the Belle Époque ended their careers with broken bodies, no money, and no options. Here is what makes me angry. These women created the entertainment industry. The can-can, the cabaret show, the modern nightclub, all of it came from the Belle Époque and was built by these performers. Moulin Rouge is still a famous tourist attraction today because of what La Goulou and Jane Averill and hundreds of other dancers created. But how many tourists who visit Moulin Rouge know their names? How many people who see Toulouse-Lautrec's posters know that Jane Avril died in poverty? How many recognise that the glamorous Belle Époque entertainment industry was built on exploitation? There is one more performer I want to tell you about, Mistinguett, whose real name was Jeanne Bourgeois. Mistinguett started performing in 1895 when she was 20 years old. She sang, she danced, she acted, she did comedy. She was versatile and talented and beautiful, but what made her a star was her legs. Mistinguett had her legs insured for 500,000 francs, which was an enormous publicity stunt and also reflected her genuine value. Her legs were famous. People came to shows just to see them. She understood that her body was her brand and she marketed it brilliantly. She performed well into her 70s. She was one of the few performers who managed to sustain a career across decades, reinventing herself as tastes changed. And when she died in 1956 at age 80, she died wealthy. Mistinguett succeeded by being ruthless. She controlled her image, her contracts, her money. She had affairs strategically. She fired people who did not serve her interests. She understood that in an industry designed to chew up women and spit them out, she had to be harder, smarter, and more calculating than anyone else. Was she likable? Not particularly, but she survived. And in the Belle Époque entertainment industry, survival was success. So when you think about the performers of the Belle Époque, hold these contradictions in your mind. The glamour and the exploitation, the fame and the poverty, the art and the abuse. The women who danced and sang and acted were creating something new, something that would define entertainment for the next century. But they were also being used, discarded, and forgotten. And the beautiful spectacles they created were beautiful because we chose not to see the cost. The performers danced and sang to survive. But there was another group of women who were not trying to survive. They were trying to change everything. The feminists, the suffragettes, the radicals who looked at Belle Époque society and said, this is not good enough. These women were not asking for better treatment. They were demanding fundamental transformation. And the system they challenged was so powerful, so entrenched, that many of them would not live to see the changes they fought for. Let me tell you about the women who dared to imagine a different world. About the feminists who tried to tear down the Belle Époque's beautiful facade and build something better in its place. On June 4th, 1913, a woman named Emily Wilding Davison walked onto the Epsom Derby racetrack in England during the most famous horse race of the year. The King's horse was coming around the final turn. Thousands of spectators were screaming. And Emily stepped directly into the path of the galloping horse. The impact was catastrophic. The horse hit her at full speed. She was thrown into the air. The jockey was thrown from the saddle. Both Emily and the jockey suffered terrible injuries. The horse stumbled but survived. The jockey eventually recovered. Emily Wilding Davison died 4 days later from a fractured skull. She was 40 years old. And here is what the newspapers debated in the aftermath. Was it suicide? Was it a protest? Was it an accident? Emily had purchased a return train ticket, which suggested she planned to go home, but she had sewn suffragette flags into the lining of her coat, which suggested she intended to make a statement. We will never know her exact intentions, but we know this. Emily Wilding Davison had been fighting for women's right to vote for years. She'd been arrested 9 times. She had been force-fed in prison after going on hunger strike. She had hidden in a broom closet in the Houses of Parliament overnight, so she could claim on the census that her residence was the House of Commons, making a symbolic point that women should be represented where laws were made. And on June 4th, 1913, whether by plan or by desperate impulse, she walked in front of the King's horse. And the suffragette movement had its martyr. This is the part of the Belle Époque story that makes people uncomfortable. Because when we talk about this era, we want to focus on the beauty, the art, the fashion. We do not want to talk about the women who were so desperate for change that they were willing to die for it. But they existed, and their story is essential. Let me take you back a bit. The fight for women's suffrage, the right to vote, had been going on throughout the entire Belle Époque. In France, in Britain, in the United States, in Germany, women were organising, writing, protesting, demanding political rights. And they were being ignored, mocked, arrested, and brutalised for it. In France, Hubertine Auclair was one of the first French suffragettes. She founded the Women's Suffrage Society in 1876, when she was just 26 years old. For the next 40 years, she wrote, she organised, she petitioned the government. She published a newspaper called La Citoyenne, the Female Citizen, from 1881 to 1908. Hubertine was brilliant and strategic. She understood that women needed economic independence before they could have political power. She advocated for equal pay, property rights, divorce law reform. She argued that political rights and economic rights were inseparable. In 1881, she did something radical. She refused to pay taxes. Her argument was simple: no taxation without representation. If women could not vote, why should they pay taxes to support a government that did not represent them? The government seized her furniture to pay the tax debt. Hubertine made sure journalists were there to document it. The image of government officials carrying furniture out of a woman's apartment because she demanded the right to vote became a powerful symbol. But here is the tragic part. Hubertine Auclair died in 1914, just weeks before World War I began. She never saw the French women get the right to vote. That did not happen until 1944, 30 years after her death. Think about that. She fought for 40 years. She sacrificed her comfort, her safety, her reputation, and she died without seeing the change she worked for. This was the reality for most feminists of the Belle Époque. They planted seeds they would never see grow. In Britain, the suffragette movement became increasingly militant after 1905. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia founded the Women's Social and Political Union. Their motto was deeds not words, and they meant it. Suffragettes chained themselves to railings outside government buildings. They smashed windows. They set fire to mailboxes. They bombed empty buildings. They slashed paintings in museums. They disrupted political meetings by shouting and unfurling banners. The British public was horrified. This was not how respectable women were supposed to behave, and that was exactly the point. The suffragettes had tried being respectable. They had written petitions and held peaceful demonstrations for decades, and they'd been ignored. Violence was a last resort, a desperate attempt to force people to pay attention, and it worked in a terrible way. The suffragettes became impossible to ignore. Every act of vandalism made headlines. Every arrest generated publicity. Emmeline Pankhurst was arrested repeatedly, once giving a speech from the dock that became famous. She said, and I am paraphrasing because the full speech was long, that women had tried every peaceful means available. They had been patient, they had been reasonable, and they had been dismissed as hysterical and irrational no matter what they did. So if they were going to be called irrational anyway, they might as well actually do something dramatic enough to force change. The government responded with brutality. Suffragettes who went on hunger strike in prison were force-fed through tubes, shoved down their throats or up their noses. This was torture. Women described it as one of the most violent and violating experiences of their lives. Some suffered permanent damage to their throats and digestive systems. The British government passed the Cat and Mouse Act in 1913. Under this law, hunger-striking suffragettes could be released from prison when they became too weak, then rearrested once they recovered. The idea was to break them psychologically by making imprisonment unpredictable and endless. It did not work. The suffragettes kept fighting. Now, here is something important to understand. Not all feminists supported the militant tactics. There were significant debates within the movement about whether violence was justified. Millicent Fawcett led the non-militant suffragists in Britain. She believed in peaceful protest, in working within the system, in gradually convincing men in power to support women's suffrage. She disagreed strongly with Pankhurst's tactics, and both strategies were necessary. The militants made headlines and forced the issue into public consciousness. The moderates provided a respectable alternative that made male politicians feel safer supporting suffrage. They needed each other, even if they did not always acknowledge it. Let me tell you about a French feminist who took a different approach. Marguerite Durand. Marguerite was a former actress who became a journalist. In 1897, she founded La Fronde, a daily newspaper written entirely by women, for women. Every single person on the staff, from the writers to the typesetters to the delivery workers, was female. This was revolutionary. Newspapers were male spaces. The idea that women could produce a professional daily newspaper was considered absurd. Marguerite proved them wrong. La Fronde covered politics, science, arts, international news, everything a regular newspaper covered. But it also covered issues that other papers ignored. Women's working conditions, maternal mortality, lack of education for girls, and domestic violence. Marguerite used the newspaper to advocate for women's suffrage, but also for broader social change. She understood that voting rights alone would not fix everything. Women needed education, economic opportunity, legal protections. She also did something clever. She made La Fronde beautiful and well-designed. She wanted to prove that a woman-run publication could be just as professional, just as serious, just as aesthetically sophisticated as any male-run paper. La Fronde lasted until 1905. It eventually folded for financial reasons, newspapers being expensive to run. But for 8 years, it existed as proof that women could do journalism, could run a business, could participate in public intellectual life. Marguerite continued her activism after the paper closed. In 1907, she organized a massive feminist congress in Paris with representatives from multiple countries. She was building international networks, connecting French feminists with movements in Britain, Germany, the United States. But again, she never saw the French women get the vote. She died in 1936, 8 years before suffrage was granted. Let me tell you about an American connection, because the fight for women's rights was international. In 1908, the International Woman Suffrage Alliance held its 4th Congress in Amsterdam. Women from 24 countries attended. They shared strategies, discussed tactics, and built solidarity across borders. The American delegation included women like Carrie Chapman Catt, who was brilliant at organization and strategy. The British sent representatives from both the militant and non-militant wings. French feminists attended, though they were often frustrated that French law lagged so far behind other countries. This international network was crucial. When suffragettes in one country tried a new tactic, suffragettes in other countries learned from it. When one government cracked down on activists, international pressure could sometimes help. The movement was global, but the Belle Époque ended before most of these women saw success. World War I began in August 1914, and everything changed. The war killed millions of men, and suddenly women were needed. Needed in factories, needed in fields, needed in hospitals, needed to keep society functioning while men were dying in trenches. Women proved they could do everything they had been told they could not do. They worked in munitions factories handling explosives, they drove ambulances, They managed businesses. They did physically demanding labor that supposedly only men could handle. And after the war, it became much harder for governments to justify denying women the vote. If women could build bombs and drive trucks and run factories, clearly they could mark a ballot. Britain granted some women the vote in 1918, full suffrage in 1928. The United States ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920. France stubbornly did not grant women suffrage until 1944. But here is what haunts me. Emily Wilding Davison died in 1913. Hubertine Auclair died in 1914. Marguerite Durand died in 1936 without seeing French suffrage. Emmeline Pankhurst died in 1928, just weeks after British women gained full voting equality. These women fought for decades. They sacrificed their safety, their reputations, their comfort. They were arrested, force-fed, publicly mocked, physically attacked, and most of them died before their goals were achieved. The changes they fought for came largely because of World War I, because the war created conditions that made women's political participation undeniable, not because governments suddenly decided women deserved rights, but because women proved so essential during the crisis that denying them rights became politically impossible. That is not fair. They should have had rights because they were human beings, not because they proved useful during a war. But that is how change happened, slowly, painfully, over the bodies of women who fought for it. There is something else I want to mention. The feminists of the Belle Époque were not perfect. Many of them held views that we would find deeply problematic today. Some French feminists were nationalists who opposed immigration. Some British suffragettes made racist arguments about white women deserving the vote more than colonized peoples. Some American suffragists from the South actively worked to exclude black women from the movement. The fight for women's rights in this era was often tangled up with nationalism, racism, and class prejudice. We cannot ignore that, and we cannot romanticize these women as perfect heroines. But we also cannot dismiss what they accomplished. They challenged a system that told them they were intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, biologically unsuited for public life. They insisted on their right to participate in democracy, and they changed the world, even if imperfectly, even if too slowly. When I think about the women of the Belle Époque, the feminists make me feel the most conflicted, because they saw clearly. They understood that the beautiful era was built on women's oppression. They named it. They fought it. They refused to accept that beauty and art and culture justified inequality. And they lost over and over again, until finally, after most of them were dead, they won. I think about Hubertine Auclair publishing her newspaper for nearly 30 years. I think about Emily Wilding Davison sewing suffragette flags into her coat lining. I think about the women who went on hunger strike and endured force-feeding. I think about Marguerite Durand running her all-female newspaper and proving it could be done. And I think about how history has treated them. Emily Wilding Davison is remembered, mostly because she died dramatically. Emmeline Pankhurst is famous, but most of the others, footnotes, names in academic papers, forgotten except by specialists. The Belle Époque did not want these women. They disrupted the fantasy. They insisted on talking about ugly realities when everyone wanted to focus on beautiful surfaces. They made people uncomfortable, and discomfort is powerful. It is necessary. The feminists of the Belle Époque understood that comfort was the enemy of change, so they made themselves as uncomfortable as possible to be around, hoping that eventually someone would find it easier to just give women rights than to keep fighting them. It took longer than it should have, it cost more than it should have, but it worked. So as we come to the end of this story, as we approach August 1914 and the beginning of World War I want you to remember All the women we have talked about, the ones trapped in corsets and the ones trapped in marriage, the seamstresses and the courtesans, the designers and the performers, and the feminists who looked at all of it and said, no, this is not enough, we deserve more. Because on August 1st, 1914, everything changed. The beautiful era ended not gradually but suddenly, violently, completely. And the world that emerged from the war was different in ways no one could have predicted. Let me tell you about the end. About August 1914, when the music stopped and the lights went out and the Belle Époque died in a single month. There is a photograph taken in Paris on August 3rd, 1914. It shows a crowd gathered outside a cafe, all of them reading newspapers. The men are wearing suits and hats. A few women stand at the edges of the crowd. Everyone's face shows the same expression: shock, disbelief, horror. The headline they are reading says that Germany has declared war on France. 24 hours earlier, these same people had been going about their normal lives, shopping, working, eating in restaurants, planning summer vacations. The idea that war was coming seemed distant, theoretical, something diplomats would work out. And then, in the space of 1 week in early August 1914, the entire world collapsed. June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo. Most people barely noticed. Barely. Political assassinations happened. They were unfortunate but not catastrophic. Surely the diplomats would handle it. July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This was more serious but still contained. A regional dispute in the Balkans. Tragic for the people involved, but not a threat to Paris, to London, to the cafes and theatres and fashion houses of the Belle Époque. August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium and Britain declared war on Germany. 7 days. That is all it took, 7 days from a regional conflict to a continental catastrophe. And the beautiful era was over. I want you to understand how sudden this was. In late July 1914, people were still planning for autumn fashion shows. Theatres were scheduling their fall seasons. Society women were making arrangements for their country estates. Life was continuing normally. By mid-August, millions of men were mobilizing for war. Trains that had carried tourists were now carrying soldiers. Buildings that had hosted parties were being converted to hospitals, and everyone was trying to understand how this had happened so fast. Let me tell you what the first days of war looked like in Paris. On August 2nd, the French government ordered general mobilization. Every able-bodied man between the ages of 20 and 48 was required to report for military service. There were mobilization posters on every street corner. The same elegant Paris that had hosted the 1900 Universal Exhibition was now plastered with images of soldiers and urgent calls to duty. Families said goodbye to sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. And here is what almost everyone believed. The war would be over by Christmas, maybe sooner, a few months at most. This was the prevailing wisdom. Modern warfare was so destructive, so expensive that no country could sustain it for long. The war would be brief and decisive. They were catastrophically wrong. The First Battle of the Marne began on September 6, 1914, just 1 month into the war. It was fought about 30 miles east of Paris. The French and British stopped the German advance, preventing the capture of Paris. This was considered a great victory, but the cost was staggering. French casualties in the first month of war exceeded 250,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing in 1 month. Think about that number. 250,000 casualties in 30 days. The Belle Époque had lasted roughly 15 years, from about 1895 to 1914. In that entire time, in all the conflicts and colonial wars France had been involved in, the casualties did not approach what happened in the first month of World War I, and it did not stop. The war settled into a stalemate. Trenches were dug from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Millions of men faced each other across a few hundred yards of devastated landscape, and they died by the thousands every day for 4 years. But let me bring this back to the women we have been talking about, because the war changed everything for them too. Remember the seamstresses we discussed? The women who worked 18-hour days making beautiful gowns. When the war started, the fashion industry collapsed almost overnight. Wealthy women were not ordering elaborate evening gowns when their sons were dying in trenches. The workshops that had employed thousands of seamstresses shut down. Some of these women found work in munitions factories, making shells and bullets instead of dresses. The work was dangerous. Explosives could detonate during manufacturing. Chemical exposure caused illness. Women's hands turned yellow from handling TNT, earning them the nickname Canary Girls, Semdi. But the pay was better than sewing. And there was a grim satisfaction in knowing their work was directly supporting the war effort, supporting the men who were fighting. Many women said in letters and diaries that they felt useful for the first time, that their labour was valued in a way it never had been before. The fashion designers we talked about. Jeanne Paquin kept her house open during the war, but pivoted to practical clothing. Simpler designs, fabrics that did not require elaborate labour. She also supported the war effort financially, and turned part of her workshop into a space for making bandages and supplies for soldiers. The performers? The cabarets and theatres stayed open, but the mood was completely different. Entertainment now served a purpose. It was meant to keep morale up, to give soldiers on leave a few hours of distraction before returning to the front. Jane Averill, the dancer we discussed, continued performing during the war years, but she later wrote that dancing felt hollow. How could she lose herself in movement when she knew that men were dying just miles away? The joy that had made her performances special was gone. The feminists had a complicated relationship with the war. Some, like Emmeline Pankhurst in Britain, suspended their suffrage campaigns and supported the war effort. Pankhurst argued that defeating Germany was essential and that women should prove their patriotism by supporting the war. Other feminists were horrified by this position. They argued that supporting the war betrayed feminist principles, that nationalism and militarism were inherently patriarchal forces that feminists should oppose. In 1915, women from multiple countries held an International Congress of Women at The Hague in the Netherlands. Over 1,000 women attended despite their governments trying to prevent them from travelling. They passed resolutions calling for mediated peace, for disarmament, for democratic control of foreign policy. They were mocked as naive, as hysterical, as unpatriotic. Male journalists wrote dismissive articles about women pretending to understand international politics. But these women understood something that the generals and politicians did not. They understood that this war would destroy an entire generation, and that nothing, no territorial gain or national pride, was worth that cost. They were right, but no one listened. The war lasted 4 years, 3 months and 10 days. It killed approximately 20 million people. 17 million of those were military deaths. 3 million were civilians, and these numbers do not capture the millions more who were wounded, traumatized, displaced, or who died in the immediate aftermath from disease and starvation. The Belle Époque's opulence, its art, its culture, its emphasis on beauty and pleasure and elegance, all of it felt obscene in the face of industrial-scale slaughter. Let me tell you about one specific woman whose story captures the transformation. Vera Brittain was a young British woman from a comfortable middle-class family. In 1914, she was 20 years old and had just won a scholarship to Oxford University, which was extraordinary for a woman at that time. She was engaged to a young man named Roland Leighton. Her brother Edward and two close friends, Victor Richardson and Geoffrey Thurlow, were also part of her social circle. When war broke out, all three men enlisted. Vera suspended her studies at Oxford to become a nurse. She wanted to do something useful, to be close to the war, to understand what the men she loved were experiencing. Roland Leighton was killed on December 23, 1915. He was 20 years old. Vera received the news 2 days after Christmas. Her brother Edward survived until 1918, when he was killed in action in June, just months before the armistice. Victor Richardson died in 1917. Geoffrey Thurlow was blinded and severely wounded. By the time the war ended, everyone Vera had loved at age 20 was dead or destroyed. She wrote about this experience in her memoir, Testament of Youth, published in 1933. And in it, she described the feeling of her generation being sacrificed for nothing. She wrote, and I am paraphrasing, that they had been raised to believe in progress, in civilization, in the triumph of rationality and culture. And then the war proved that none of it mattered, that beneath the veneer of civilization was barbarism, that culture and art and education had not made humans better. They had just made them better at killing each other. This was the epitaph of the Belle Époque. The beautiful era that believed in progress had produced the most destructive war in human history up to that point, and the world that emerged from the war was fundamentally different. Women had the vote in many countries, yes, but they'd earned it through suffering and loss, not through justice finally prevailing. The men who returned from the trenches were traumatized, unable to readjust to civilian life. Entire villages in France had been obliterated, their populations wiped out. The art and culture that followed World War I was dark, cynical, experimental. The confidence of the Belle Époque was gone. In its place was the lost generation, Dadaism, surrealism, art that reflected trauma and meaninglessness and the collapse of old certainties. I think about the women we have talked about throughout this story. How many of them lost sons or husbands or brothers in the war? How many of the seamstresses who survived poverty only to see their workshops close? How many of the courtesans who had built precarious independence only to lose their wealthy patrons to war? We know some specific stories. Le Goulue, the can-can dancer, was already destitute by 1914, so the war just made her poverty more acute. Cléo de Mérode stopped performing after the war. The world had changed too much. Jane Avril continued dancing but never recaptured her earlier success. The dollar princesses, the American heiresses who had married into European nobility, found themselves in an impossible position. Their husbands were fighting for countries that were at war with each other. If you were an American woman married to a German aristocrat, what did you do when America entered the war in 1917? Your birth country and your adopted country were enemies. Some of these marriages survived, many did not. The social world that had created the dollar princess phenomenon was shattered. After the war, European aristocracy was diminished, many fortunes were lost, and marrying a title no longer had the same appeal. Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose miserable wedding we discussed earlier, divorced her husband, the Duke of Marlborough, in 1921. She remarried a man she actually loved and spent the rest of her life doing philanthropy. But she wrote in her memoirs that the war had changed everything, that the world of her youth was gone completely. The Belle Époque had been built on certain assumptions, that progress was inevitable, that civilization was advancing, that life for the wealthy would continue in comfort indefinitely, that art and culture and beauty mattered more than politics or economics or military power. The war destroyed every single one of those assumptions, And here is the cruelest irony. The feminists we talked about in the last section, the ones who fought for women's rights, many of them saw those rights finally granted in the aftermath of the war. British women got the vote in 1918, American women in 1920, German women in 1918, Russian women after the revolution in 1917, but they got these rights in a world that had been destroyed. The victory they had fought for came covered in blood and ashes, and many of the women who had fought hardest never lived to see it. Hubertine Auclair died in April 1914, 4 months before the war started. She spent 40 years fighting for French women's suffrage and died without seeing it, without even knowing that a war was coming that would transform everything. Emily Wilding Davison died in June 1913, just over a year before the war. If she had lived another 5 years, she would have seen British women get the vote, but she did not live. She died throwing herself in front of a horse to force change, and Emmeline Pankhurst, who did live to see British women gain voting rights, also lived to see her son killed in the war. She got what she wanted and lost what she loved. That was the bargain the war offered to so many women. I want to end this section with an image. There is a photograph from November 11th, 1918, the day the armistice was signed and the war officially ended. It shows crowds in Paris celebrating in the streets. People are crying, hugging, waving flags. The war is over. They survived. But if you look closely at individual faces in the photograph, you see something else. The joy is real, but it is mixed with exhaustion, with grief, with a kind of haunted awareness that the world they lost will never come back. The Belle Époque is gone. The beautiful era is over. And what comes next is uncertain, frightening, and irrevocably different from what came before. But here is what I want you to remember as we move into the final section of this story. The end of the Belle Époque was not just about the war. The war was the catalyst, the explosive end. But the conditions that made the war possible, the inequalities, the nationalisms, the exploitation, the refusal to give women and workers and colonized peoples their rights peacefully, all of that was built into the Belle Époque from the beginning. The beautiful era was always rotting underneath. The war just made the rot visible. And so as we come to the conclusion, I want to ask you to think about what we can learn from this. About beauty built on suffering, about progress that is not evenly distributed, about systems that resist change until catastrophe forces it. Because the patterns we have talked about, they did not end in 1918. They are still with us. And understanding where they came from, understanding what the Belle Époque really was beneath its beautiful surface, that might help us see our own world more clearly. Let me bring this story home. Let me tell you what the Belle Époque teaches us about our own time, about the choices we face, about the kind of world we want to build. So here we are, at the end of the story. We have travelled through 15 years of history, from 1895 to 1914. We have met seamstresses who bled into their work and courtesans who owned mansions. We have watched women crushed by corsets and liberated by bicycles. We have seen fashion designers erased from history and performers exploited on stages. We have followed feminists who died before their victories and watched an entire civilization collapse in 7 days. And now I want to ask you a question. Why does this matter? Why spend 2 hours talking about women who lived and died over a century ago? Because the patterns we have explored do not stay in the past. They echo forward. They shape the world we live in right now. And if we do not understand where these patterns came from, we cannot break them. Let me show you what I mean. The Belle Époque taught us that beauty can hide terrible suffering, that a society can produce exquisite art and culture while systematically exploiting the people who make that art and culture possible. Think about the fashion industry today. We have moved beyond the Belle Époque in many ways. Women can vote, own property, get divorced, choose their careers, but the fundamental structure of fashion production has not changed as much as we like to think. Today, the average garment worker in Bangladesh makes about $95 per month. That is roughly $3 per day. They work in factories that are often unsafe. In 2013, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh killed over 1,000 garment workers. Most of them women. Meanwhile, the global fashion industry is worth over $2 trillion. Luxury brands make billions in profit. Fashion shows in Paris and Milan and New York are spectacular, beautiful, cutting edge. Sound familiar? Different century, same pattern. Beauty built on exploitation. Wealth concentrated at the top while the workers who create that wealth struggle to survive. Or consider the entertainment industry. We have talked about the performers of the Belle Époque, the dancers and actresses who were simultaneously celebrated and exploited, whose bodies were used and then discarded. In 2017, the Me Too movement exploded into public consciousness. Women across industries, but especially in entertainment, shared stories of sexual harassment and assault. Stories of being told that accepting sexual advances from powerful men was just part of the job. Stories of careers destroyed for saying no. The specific details are different, but the core dynamic is the same. Women's bodies and labour are valuable, but women themselves are not protected. The industry profits from their talent while treating them as disposable. The parallels are everywhere once you start looking. The Belle Époque showed us how medical establishments can fail women through arrogance and institutional inertia. Doctors refused to wash their hands because it hurt their pride, and women died. Today, maternal mortality in the United States is higher than in any other developed nation, and black women in America die from pregnancy-related causes at rates 3 to 4 times higher than white women. This is not because of biology. This is because of systemic racism in healthcare, because black women's pain is not taken as seriously, because the medical system still fails the most vulnerable. Different specifics, same core problem. Women's lives are not valued enough to fix systems that we know are broken. The Belle Époque demonstrated how women's work is erased from history. Fashion designers who built international empires were forgotten, while male designers were celebrated. Women's contributions were systematically minimized or attributed to men. This is still happening. Studies consistently show that when women contribute to collaborative work, their contributions are often attributed to male colleagues. Women in STEM fields have their research cited less often than men. Women artists are underrepresented in museums and galleries. Women writers are reviewed less frequently than men. We like to think we have moved past this, but the erasure continues. It is just more subtle now, more deniable. And here is perhaps the most important parallel. The Belle Époque showed us what happens when societies ignore inequality until catastrophe forces change. The feminists of that era fought peacefully for decades. They wrote, they organized, they petitioned, and they were ignored, mocked, dismissed. Change did not come through reasoned argument. It came through war, through societal collapse, through catastrophe. Women got the vote not because societies decided it was the right thing to do. They got it because World War I created conditions where denying women rights was no longer sustainable. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout history. Change resisted until crisis forces it. Rights withheld until maintaining the status quo becomes impossible. And it makes me wonder, what are we resisting now? What changes are we refusing to make peacefully that will eventually be forced upon us by catastrophe? Climate change comes to mind. We have known for decades that we need to transform our energy system, our consumption patterns, our entire economic model. But we resist. We make small adjustments while avoiding fundamental change. and every year that we delay, the eventual reckoning becomes more severe. Economic inequality is another example. The wealth gap in many countries is now approaching or exceeding Belle Époque levels. A tiny elite controls an enormous percentage of resources, while millions struggle with basic needs. We know this is unsustainable. History teaches us that extreme inequality eventually produces crisis. But we resist redistribution. We resist structural change. The lesson of the Belle Époque is that resistance to necessary change does not prevent change. It just ensures that change comes violently, painfully, catastrophically. But here is the thing. This does not have to be our path. We can learn from history instead of repeating it. The Belle Époque also showed us examples of resistance, of people who refused to accept injustice even when the cost was high. Think about the new women on their bicycles, claiming independence in small but meaningful ways. Think about Cléo de Mérode refusing to participate in the exploitation system and finding another path. Think about Jeanne Paquin building a fashion empire on her own terms. Think about the feminists who kept fighting even when they knew they might not live to see victory. These women did not wait for permission. They did not wait for society to change. They changed what they could change in their own lives, and in doing so, they created cracks in the system. And eventually those cracks became breaks. The system fell apart. And yes, it took a war. Yes, it was catastrophic. But the changes that followed, imperfect as they were built on foundations these women laid. So what can we do? What does the Belle Époque teach us about action in our own time? First, see clearly. Look past the beautiful surfaces to the structures underneath. Ask who benefits from current arrangements. Ask who pays the cost. Ask whose labour is invisible, whose suffering is hidden, whose contributions are erased. The Belle Époque looked beautiful if you were wealthy and did not look too closely. But once you started paying attention, once you saw the seamstresses bleeding and the women dying in childbirth and the performers being exploited, you could not unsee it. Our world is the same. We have beautiful surfaces, technology, entertainment, consumer goods, all easily accessible. But underneath there is suffering we choose not to see. Factory workers making our phones, delivery drivers with no bathroom breaks, gig workers with no benefits, refugees dying trying to reach safety. See it. Do not look away, because we cannot change what we refuse to acknowledge. Second, remember that individual actions matter even when they feel small. The women of the Belle Époque who made different choices, who refused to participate in exploitation, who built alternative systems, they mattered. Not every woman could be Emmeline Pankhurst throwing bombs, but every woman who chose to read, to work, to claim a bit of independence, to support other women, they all contributed to change. You do not have to be a revolutionary to make a difference. You just have to refuse to be complicit. Third, understand that change is messy and imperfect and often comes too late. The Belle Époque feminists did not achieve perfect equality. They did not dismantle patriarchy. They got women the vote and some legal rights, and those victories were compromised and incomplete. But incomplete progress is still progress, and the work continues. Every generation builds on what the previous generation achieved. The women we have talked about in this story, they did not see the world we live in now, but they made it possible, and we have a responsibility to continue their work, to push further, to address the inequalities they did not have time to fix. Fourth, be wary of nostalgia. The Belle Époque is remembered as beautiful because we have chosen to remember the beauty and forget the suffering. Every era does this. We romanticize the past, we smooth over the rough edges, we focus on aesthetics and ignore injustice. People in the future will do this with our time too. They will look at our art, our technology, our achievements, and they will be tempted to call it a golden age. Unless we make sure to document the suffering, to center the voices of those who are marginalized, to insist that the full story be told. Do not let beauty distract from injustice. Do not let progress in one area excuse regression in another. Do not let nostalgia make you forget that every era has its victims, and finally remember that systems that resist peaceful change will eventually face violent change. This is not a threat. This is a historical pattern. The Belle Époque refused to reform itself and it collapsed catastrophically. We have the opportunity to do better, to make changes before crisis forces them, to build more equitable systems voluntarily, rather than having them torn down and rebuilt in chaos. But that requires courage. It requires sacrifice. It requires wealthy and powerful people giving up some of their wealth and power voluntarily. And history suggests this rarely happens without enormous pressure. So pressure must be applied, peacefully if the possible, but consistently, relentlessly until change comes. I think about the women we have met in this story, and I am struck by how many of them were simultaneously victims and agents of change. They were trapped by systems they did not create, but they pushed against those systems. They made choices within constraints. They survived, and sometimes they thrived, and they changed what they could change. Consuelo Vanderbilt was forced into marriage, but she eventually divorced and built a different life. The seamstresses formed unions and went on strike even when strikes failed. The performers created art even in exploitative conditions. The feminists fought even when they knew they might not win. None of them were perfect. All of them were limited by their time and circumstances. But they did what they could with what they had. And that is what we can do too. See the patterns, refuse complicity, support each other, push for change, document the suffering so future generations cannot forget. Build alternatives where we can, and recognize that the work is never finished. The Belle Époque ended in 1914, but the patterns it exemplified, the tensions it contained, the changes it resisted, those did not end. They transformed, they evolved, they are with us still. We live in an era of enormous wealth and technological achievement, and also enormous inequality and injustice. We create beautiful things and we hide ugly truths. We celebrate progress and we ignore those left behind. We are, in some ways, living in another Belle Époque, another beautiful era that might be rotting underneath. The question is whether we will see it in time, whether we will choose to change before catastrophe forces change upon us, whether we will learn from history or repeat it. I do not have all the answers. This story does not have a neat moral or a simple solution. History is complicated. People are complicated. Change is hard and slow and often comes at terrible cost. But I know this. The women of the Belle Époque who fought for change, who refused to accept injustice, who documented suffering and demanded better, they were right. They were on the right side of history, even when history was not on their side. And we have the same choice they had. We can accept things as they are. We can enjoy the beauty and ignore the suffering. We can wait for someone else to fix things. Or we can see clearly, act courageously, and push for change even when it is difficult, even when it costs us, even when we might not live to see the results. The Belle Époque is gone, but its lessons remain. Beauty is not enough if it is built on suffering. Progress is not real if it does not include everyone. And change delayed is not change denied. It is change that will eventually come violently instead of peacefully. We can choose differently. We can do better. But only if we learn from the past instead of romanticizing it. Only if we see our own time clearly instead of through a filter of comforting illusions. The women we have talked about, they deserved better than they got. They deserved rights without having to fight for them. They deserved safety without having to demand it. They deserved recognition without having to be erased and then recovered by historians a century later. We can honour them by building a world that is more just, by refusing to repeat their mistakes, by learning from their courage, and by telling their stories, by remembering them, by insisting that history include their voices, their struggles, their contributions, because they mattered. Every seamstress who bled into her work mattered. Every woman who died in childbirth mattered. Every performer who was exploited mattered. Every designer who was erased mattered. Every feminist who fought and died without seeing victory mattered. Their lives had value beyond what they produced, beyond how they were used, beyond how history remembered them. And so do ours, so do yours. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to this long and complicated story, for sitting with the beauty and the suffering both. I hope it has given you something to think about. I hope it has helped you see our own world a little differently. The Belle Époque was the beautiful era, but it was also the brutal era, the unjust era, the era that refused to change until war forced it to. We can be different. We can be better. But only if we choose to be, only if we act. The story of the Belle Époque is over, but our story is still being written. What kind of era will we create? What will future generations say about us? Will they look back at our beauty and our achievements, or will they look past the surface and see what we chose to ignore? That is up to us, all of us, and the time to choose is now. Thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and I will see you in the next story.